Hey everyone. I just wanted to thank you for all the support lately. Reading your comments and seeing your likes genuinely means a lot to me. If everyone watching leaves a quick comment and a like, it would really help the channel grow. I truly appreciate you being here. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. My name is Quinnland, and I've been a ranger with the National Park Service for 7 years, though some days it feels like I've been doing this job my entire life. I came to Glacier in early April, just as the snow was beginning its reluctant retreat from the lower elevations. Most people don't understand why anyone would volunteer for this position. Assigned to a single remote patrol cabin near Lake McDonald, maintaining trails that few hikers ever traverse, conducting solo patrols through wilderness that stretches for 60,000 acres of unforgiving terrain. The pay is modest. The isolation is absolute. But I had my reasons. I left a different career 3 years ago. Accountancy, if you can believe it, spreadsheets and tax codes, fluorescent lights, and the whispered anxiety of corporate expectations. I was good at it, which made it worse. I was trapped in competence. My doctor called it depression. My family called it a phase. What I called it was suffocation. At 34 years old, I realized I had built a life that looked correct from the outside but felt hollow when I examined it in the dark hours before dawn. So I quit. I took online courses in wilderness management and emergency response. I spent months volunteering at state parks, working with established rangers, learning the practical skills they don't teach in classrooms. Glacier National Park hired me because I was overqualified and underambitious, a combination that worried some of my supervisors but pleased my immediate boss, Dennis, a weathered man in his 60s who had been assigned to the region for nearly 30 years. He understood something about the mountains that most people never grasp. They offer a particular kind of honesty. The wilderness doesn't care about your education or your failures. It simply is, and if you're respectful enough, careful enough, humble enough, it allows you to exist within it. My cabin sat on the western shore of Lake McDonald, separated from the main lodge by 4 miles of dense forest. The cabin itself was built in 1962, constructed from logs and stone with a pitched metal roof that collected snow like a reservoir. It had electricity from a generator, a wood-burning stove, and a radio connection to park headquarters 15 miles away. I had requested this assignment specifically because of its isolation. I wanted to be alone. I wanted to know what solitude actually meant. April in the high country is a study in extremes. Daytime temperatures might reach the mid-40s, but once the sun dropped behind the continental divide, the mercury plummeted. Snow still clung to the north-facing slopes. The lake was beginning to shed its winter crust, but the water remained cold enough to kill in minutes. I spent my first days taking inventory, checking equipment, reviewing trail conditions, testing the radio system, and reading the previous ranger's logs. That previous ranger was named Marcus Reed, and his entries became increasingly erratic as winter deepened. By December, his notes had shifted from the routine observations he'd recorded in October to something else entirely. Brief, fragmented entries about unusual animal tracks, strange sounds at night, hikers reporting that they'd seen something moving through the trees at dawn. In January, a single line: "Something is wrong with how the animals are behaving." His final entry, dated February 9th, read simply, "I'm done, transferring out, don't want to explain why." I found these notes curious rather than alarming. Every ranger develops their own relationship with the mountains. Some people cannot handle the solitude. Others project their fears onto innocent phenomena. I assumed Marcus was the latter type. My first week was routine. I hiked the major trails, Hidden Meadow, Gunsight Pass, the ridge circuit that offered views of the entire lake system. I noted fallen trees that needed clearing, bridges in need of repair, erosion patterns that required monitoring. I filed reports. I maintained equipment. I fell into the rhythm of the work, and for the first time in years I slept deeply at night, untormented by the ambient anxiety that had characterized my previous existence. It was during the second week that I first noticed the deer. I was finishing work on the northern trail section around dusk when I came across a mule deer standing in the middle of the path. This wasn't unusual. Deer regularly used the trails, and they typically retreated when they encountered humans. But this one didn't move. It stood perfectly still, head turned at an angle that seemed mechanically wrong, watching me with an intensity that suggested something more than simple animal awareness. I stopped walking. The distance between us was perhaps 30 feet. The light was failing rapidly, that brief period of twilight when colors drain from the landscape and everything becomes gradations of gray. The deer was a doe, unremarkable except for that stillness, that attention, Its eyes caught the dying light and reflected it back at me in a way that seemed deliberately directional, as if it was showing me something rather than simply existing as an animal. I spoke aloud, something I did frequently when alone in the wilderness, a way of asserting my own presence against the silence. "You need to move, friend. I'm coming through." The deer turned its head further, a motion that seemed to exceed the normal range of cervine anatomy. Its neck rotated in a way that made my sternum tight. Then it bounded away, but not down the trail. It leaped sideways, toward the thick undergrowth, with an awkwardness that suggested injury or disorientation. I heard the crash of its passage through the brush, then silence. I continued my patrol, but the encounter had introduced a small wedge of unease into my day. I told myself it was nothing. Sick animals, injured animals, animals behaving abnormally due to illness or stress, these things happened. But I made a note of it anyway, following the pattern established by my predecessor. That night I heard something moving around the cabin perimeter. The sound was distinct from wind or falling snow or the ordinary creaking of an old building. It was deliberate movement, cautious, something that was clearly attempting to avoid being heard. I turned off the interior lights and stood by the window looking out into the darkness. I could see nothing, but I could hear the soft sound of something moving through the trees beyond the cleared area around the cabin. I waited an hour, watching. The sounds eventually ceased. I finally went to bed, telling myself it was probably a wolf or a large bear, newly emerged from hibernation and exploring its territory. This explanation was logical. It fit with the established facts of the ecosystem. It required no suspension of rational thought, but as I lay in the darkness, listening to the wind move through the mountains, I found myself wondering about Marcus Reed and what had driven him from this place. I wondered whether he had also heard the sounds outside his window. I wondered whether he had also noticed the unnatural quality in the behavior of the animals. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for tracks. I found them. Paw prints in the soft earth near the woodline, large ones that could belong to a mountain lion or a grizzly. But there was something odd about their pattern. They seemed to circle the cabin multiple times, as if whatever had made them was methodical, purposeful, conducting some kind of reconnaissance. Worse, they seemed fresh. Made within the last few hours, I would estimate. I filed a report with Dennis about possible bear activity and requested additional supplies for bear-proof storage. He approved the request without comment, though I thought I detected a slight hesitation in his voice. When I asked whether Marcus Reed had reported similar issues before his transfer, Dennis was quiet for a moment. "Some people," he finally said, "aren't suited for this kind of work. Some people see things that aren't there. Don't be like that, Kalen." But what if the things were actually there? By the beginning of May, the heavy snows had retreated to the highest elevations, and the park's trails became increasingly busy with early-season hikers. My role expanded to include routine safety patrols, wellness checks on popular hiking routes, and maintenance coordination with the larger work crews based at park headquarters. The busyness of the season provided a reprieve from the peculiarities I'd been documenting. It's easier to dismiss unusual animal behavior when you have daily interaction with other humans and dozens of legitimate tasks demanding your attention, but the animals had not stopped their strange patterns. If anything, their behavior had escalated. I found a goat on the ridge trail, standing on the narrow path overlooking the 1,000-foot drop into the valley below. The animal was stationary, motionless, and as I approached, it did not flee or even glance at me. It simply continued to stare downward into the mist that rose from the gorge. When I attempted to lead it away from the cliff edge, it responded with violence, rearing up on its hind legs and striking at me with its hooves in a manner that seemed deliberate and targeted rather than reflexive. I documented the encounter: time, location, description of behavior, apparent health status. I did not mention the sense of intentionality behind the attack. I did not mention the moment when the animal locked eyes with me and I felt certain, with a clarity that was almost painful, that it was looking at me with an awareness that exceeded animal consciousness. On May 15th, I was conducting a trail clearing operation near the northern section of the lake when I discovered the hiker. The season had brought increased foot traffic, and most encounters were routine, brief conversations about trail conditions, weather, local wildlife. But this hiker was different. I found him sitting on the trail, apparently resting, though the weather was clear and the hour was only mid-morning. He was alone, which was unusual. Most early-season hikers came in pairs or small groups. As I approached, I noticed that he was not moving. His body was rigid, his posture unnaturally formal. He wore summer clothes despite the temperature still being near freezing at this elevation, and his skin had taken on a grayish tone that concerned me immediately. "Are you all right?" I called out. Do you need assistance? He turned his head slowly to regard me. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated to the point where they seemed to obscure the iris entirely. When he spoke, his voice came from his throat like he was forcing it to function. You need to leave this place, he said. His words were enunciated with mechanical precision. You need to leave before it learns your voice. I moved closer, my assessment shifting from concern to alarm. What's your name? Where are you from? Do you need medical attention? He stood abruptly, an explosive motion that suggested his body was operating under external control. He pointed toward the dense forest to the east of the trail. It's there. It's always there. It watches from where the shadow is thickest. It's learning us one by one. He stopped. His entire body stiffened. His head rotated toward the forest with that same mechanical quality I'd observed in the deer weeks before. Then he ran. He didn't walk or jog. He ran at full speed directly into the thick undergrowth, crashing through branches, apparently indifferent to injury. I pursued him for perhaps 100 yards before the terrain became impossible to navigate. I lost sight of him among the trees. I called out, but received no response. I radioed the main lodge and reported the incident, requesting an immediate ground search. What I did not report was my certainty that what I'd seen was something more than a human experiencing a mental health crisis. The search team found nothing. No trace of the hiker, no body, no evidence of his passage through the forest. His car was located in the parking area, a Subaru registered to a James Covington from Missoula, Montana. His wife had reported him missing when he failed to return 2 days earlier. Rangers expanded the search to include the entire northern section of the park. After 4 days of intensive effort, the search was called off. The official conclusion was that he'd become disoriented and was likely deceased, either from injuries sustained during his flight or from exposure. But I had seen something in his eyes during those brief moments of lucidity. I had seen terror, yes, but also a kind of understanding, knowledge that something was happening, something was aware, and something was using that awareness to do things to the people in this forest. I began researching in earnest. The park had an archive of historical documents including ranger reports dating back decades. I accessed them through the main office, ostensibly doing background research on wildlife patterns and historical incidents. What I was actually looking for was confirmation that the phenomena I was experiencing were not unique to my tenure. They were not. In 1989, a ranger named David Whitmore had filed multiple reports about unusual animal behavior, possibly indicative of neurological disease. In 1998, Ranger Sarah Chen had documented 4 separate incidents involving hikers who'd reported seeing something moving between the trees that did not move like anything native to the region. In 2004, the ranger's log contained a brief note about 2 backpackers who had been found walking the trail in the wrong direction, moving in perfect synchronization despite being separated by 50 feet and apparently unaware of each other's presence. And most disturbing, in 2011, a ranger named David Cross had written in his personal log, which I found tucked into an old filing cabinet. The Kaniawada. That's what they called it. The Blackfeet who originally inhabited this land. The skinwalkers. The ones that wear what they kill. I don't know if I believe in folklore, but I know what I've seen, and I know what I'm seeing, and I know it's hunting something. I think it's hunting us. His final entry, dated 3 months later. I'm requesting a transfer. I can't explain why, but no one would believe me anyway. I spent the next week reading every piece of information I could find about the Blackfeet Nation's historical relationship with this land, about their stories and legends, about the cultural concept of beings that could inhabit the shape and voice of others. Most academic sources dismissed these accounts as pre-modern superstition, folklore that represented psychological interpretations of natural phenomena, but some sources hinted at something darker, accounts of shamanic experiences, of encounters that could not be easily categorized as either mental illness or simple animal behavior. One source, a dissertation by an anthropologist named Dr. Eleanor Vance, approached the folklore from a different angle. She argued that such legends might represent memories of encounters with something genuinely anomalous, that indigenous cultures had developed sophisticated explanations for phenomena that fell outside conventional categories. She interviewed elderly Blackfeet tribal members who shared stories of protective protocols, of methods for identifying entities that were not what they appeared to be, of rituals designed to prevent contact. One passage stood out to me. The warning signs are behavioral first. Animals acting wrongly. Humans speaking with voices that don't match their breath, or moving in ways their muscles shouldn't allow. But the deeper sign is awareness. When you encounter it, you feel seen. Not observed, but seen. Understood at a level that goes beyond simple perception. You are being cataloged. You are being analyzed. You are being mapped for something you cannot resist. I should have reported what I was suspecting to Dennis, to park administration, to someone with authority and resources, but I couldn't articulate what I suspected without sounding unhinged. The evidence was circumstantial. The phenomena were ambiguous. Everything could be explained through conventional wildlife biology and human psychology if you simply refused to acknowledge the pattern. Instead, I did something I now recognize was foolish. I began leaving records. I started a private journal, separate from my official ranger reports, documenting every incident, every behavioral anomaly, every piece of folklore and historical account that seemed relevant. I photographed the unusual tracks. I noted the locations where the strange occurrences clustered. I was attempting to build a case, though I still didn't know a case for what. The lake itself began to show changes. The water's surface, which had been clear in early May, developed a kind of iridescence around the edges, a sheen that seemed almost oily, though analysis showed no unusual chemical composition. Sometimes in the early morning, before full light, I would see ripples on the surface that didn't correspond to any wind. They moved in geometric patterns, crossing each other, forming temporary shapes before dissipating, and the sounds at night continued. Footsteps on the cabin roof, deliberate movement in the nearby forest, a kind of vocalizing that might have been wind through the trees or might have been something else entirely. By the end of May, isolation had stopped being a comfort and had become something else. Each night I locked every door and secured every window. I kept a large knife beside my bed and my service pistol on the table nearest the kitchen. I told myself these precautions were reasonable. I told myself I was being responsible. But what I was really doing was waiting for something to cross the threshold between implausible and undeniable. That threshold was approaching. The summer season brought daily contact with visitors, hikers, campers, tourists, and the constant activity seemed to suppress the phenomena. I found myself almost grateful for the crowds, for the distraction, for the reassurance that other humans existed and that the natural world was still operating according to established rules. But underneath the relief was a growing certainty. The suppression was temporary. Something was waiting. Something was biding its time. In late June, I responded to a distress call from the Northern Trail section. 2 hikers had become separated, and the remaining person, a woman named Rebecca Aldridge, reported that her partner had walked ahead around a bend and simply failed to return. The trail was open and clear. There was nowhere he could have gone except forward or back. I coordinated with the search team and spent 6 hours combing the area. We found no trace of the missing hiker, no indication that he'd ever been on the trail. His car was located in the parking area. His girlfriend was adamant that they'd been together all morning, but he had vanished between one moment and the next, leaving no explanation. I asked Rebecca if there was anything unusual that had occurred before he disappeared. She hesitated, which was itself significant. Most people answer such questions immediately. Her hesitation suggested she was deciding whether to speak truth or maintain a more comfortable version of reality. He was acting strange, she finally said. Since we started hiking, he kept stopping and looking into the trees. He said he kept seeing something move, something that was keeping pace with us. I told him it was probably just deer or something, but he was certain. He was really frightened. And then when he walked ahead, I heard him call my name. My name, but it sounded wrong. It sounded like it was coming from multiple directions, like he was speaking from inside his own voice, if that makes sense. It made terrible sense. Did you see him? I asked. No, she whispered. After the voice called my name, I went forward to check on him, but the voice kept calling from the trees, different directions, always slightly out of sync, and it kept getting clearer, like it was learning to say my name correctly. I got scared and ran back toward the parking area. The search was expanded. The missing hiker, identified as Marcus Sherman, was never found. The official report attributed his disappearance to an accident, a fall into a hidden crevasse or ravine. Though no such geographic features existed in that section of the trail, the case was closed due to insufficient evidence and the improbability of locating a body in such terrain. The next week, I made a decision that reflected the deterioration of my judgment. I invited Rebecca to the cabin, telling her I wanted to document her account more thoroughly and provide information about rescue resources and counseling support. What I was actually doing was using her as a way to conduct an experiment. I wanted to see whether the phenomenon would manifest in front of a witness I could corroborate. It was unconscionable behavior. I was essentially using another human being as bait. But by that point, I was consumed by a need to prove that what I was experiencing was real, that I wasn't gradually losing my connection to consensus reality. She arrived on a warm afternoon in early July, and I noticed immediately that she seemed fragile in a way that went beyond the trauma of her partner's disappearance. She moved carefully, as if she was afraid of sudden motion. She spoke in a low voice and kept checking the windows. She was doing exactly what I was doing, waiting for something to manifest. We sat on the cabin porch facing the lake, and I asked her to describe the incident again in detail. She did, and as she spoke, her voice became increasingly strained. She described how the voice calling her name had seemed to be learning her, each repetition more accurate, each intonation closer to her partner's actual speech patterns. She described her certainty that something was studying how he sounded, how he moved, how he existed, and then using that knowledge to call her deeper into the forest. It wasn't trying to hurt me, she said. Not then. It was trying to understand me. It was trying to see if it could replicate me the way it had started replicating him. As she spoke, the light changed. The sun, which had been bright and direct, seemed to dim slightly, though there were no clouds visible. The shadows cast by the trees became deeper, sharper, and they seemed to move independently of their sources. "We should go inside," Rebecca said. Her voice had become urgent. As we stood to move, I saw something that made my perception fragment. In the reflection of the lake's surface, visible from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I saw a shape moving through the forest behind the cabin. I saw the cabin itself reflected. But I saw it wrong. I saw additional windows, additional structures, variations that didn't exist in consensus reality. I turned to look at Rebecca, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second that seemed to expand infinitely, I saw something underneath her face. Not a different face, but a structure, a kind of lattice of lines that suggested something was being worn, something was being inhabited. Then the moment passed, and she was simply Rebecca again, frightened but human. "Did you see it?" she asked. I nodded. We went inside, and I locked every door and window. I stood at the window watching the forest as the light continued to fade. For an hour, neither of us spoke. The silence became suffocating, but speaking seemed dangerous, as if conversation itself might be a vector of infection, a way of allowing it to understand us better. At dusk, sounds began. Not the usual nocturnal sounds of the forest. These sounds had a quality of deliberation. I heard footsteps on the roof, slowly pacing back and forth in a measured pattern. I heard something pressing against the windows, not roughly, but with a kind of patient persistence. I heard, worst of all, my own voice from outside the cabin, calling my name, repeating it, learning the exact pitch and inflection. Rebecca moved close to me, and we stood together in the center of the cabin, away from all the windows and doors. I thought about turning on the lights, then thought about how the lights would make us visible, how they would help whatever was outside understand the interior layout and our position within it. The night was the longest of my life. Nothing broke through the walls or forced its way inside, but the attempt seemed continuous. The sounds shifted and changed. They became more complex. Once I heard what sounded like multiple conversations happening simultaneously outside the cabin, different versions of my voice arguing with each other, different intonations of the same words, an attempt to find the exact combination that would compel me to open the door and step outside. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Rebecca collapsed into sleep, her body apparently reaching a limit of endurance. I remained awake, watching, listening, aware that a line had been crossed and we had entered into a space where the normal rules of existence had been suspended. In the pre-dawn hours, the sounds stopped. When morning light finally came, I went outside to find the clearing around the cabin transformed. The grass had been pressed down in intricate patterns, geometric designs that seemed to form shapes halfway between language and mathematics. The trees at the perimeter of the clearing had been marked, bark peeled in careful lines that created symbols, and in the soft earth, the tracks were everywhere. Dozens of different impressions, some clearly animal, some disturbingly humanoid, all of them suggesting a purpose that transcended simple movement through space. Rebecca saw it all. When she emerged from the cabin, she didn't scream or cry. She simply looked at the evidence of what had surrounded us during the night, and her face went blank. It was the face of someone whose relationship with reality had been severed at a fundamental level. I radioed headquarters and reported that I was requesting an immediate medical evacuation for a visitor who appeared to be in psychological crisis. Dennis arrived himself with the ambulance, and I watched as they took Rebecca away. She didn't resist or protest. She simply looked back at the forest once, with an expression that suggested she understood something about the nature of the place that no amount of clinical intervention could treat. When Dennis asked me what had happened, I found I couldn't articulate it. I told him she'd experienced a breakdown. I told him the trauma of her partner's disappearance had triggered a crisis. He looked at me for a long moment, and I realized he was seeing something in me that mirrored what I'd observed in Rebecca. "Kaylin," he said slowly, "maybe you should consider some time away from the cabin, some time in civilization, some space to think." I should have accepted, but I couldn't leave. Whatever was happening here, whatever this place had become, I needed to understand it. I needed to find the pattern in the chaos, the explanation beneath the inexplicable. July was consumed by research and observation conducted in a state of mounting paranoia that I could no longer distinguish from clarity. I stopped filing regular reports. I stopped participating in routine maintenance. I spent my days reading historical accounts and ranger logs, tracing the pattern of incidents back through decades. I spent my nights watching the forest, documenting sounds and movements, trying to construct a coherent model of what was operating in this place. What I developed was a theory, though I remained aware that it might be the product of a mind that had lost its anchoring in conventional thought. The entity and I had become convinced that it was singular, unified, though it might be expressed in multiple forms, was not simply predatory in any conventional sense. It was not hunting for food or territory. It was studying, it was learning. Each encounter, each person it isolated, each animal whose behavior it altered, was part of a systematic process of comprehension. It was mapping human cognition, human movement, human sensation, the way a scientist might map an organism they intended to perfectly replicate. The Blackfeet stories described it as something that could wear the skin of what it killed. But what if that description was metaphorically accurate, rather than literally true? What if it didn't actually require biological integration but instead required knowledge? The precise knowledge of how a human moved, spoke, thought, responded to stimuli. I found references in a colonial-era account of European traders who had encountered tribes describing an entity that could assume the form of missing relatives, that could speak with perfect accuracy but whose presence felt profoundly wrong. The traders had noted that the entity seemed to be learning human behavior, that its imitations became more sophisticated with each encounter. What if it had been here for centuries? What if it had been slowly refining its understanding of humanity with each generation, each isolated hiker, each person lost in these mountains? And what if the recent escalation of incidents suggested that it had finally achieved a threshold of knowledge, that it had reached a point where the replication was no longer partial but complete? In the third week of July, I found the hiker. I was completing a trail circuit near the northern lake section when I found her sitting beside the path, apparently resting. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, wearing day hiking clothes and carrying a standard backpack. She was not listed on any official trail registry. There were no recent reports of a missing hiker matching her description. "Hello," I said, my hand instinctively moving to the radio on my belt. "I'm a ranger. Are you okay?" She looked at me, and her eyes were completely black. Not dilated pupils, but a total absence of visible iris or sclera. Just absolute darkness in the eye sockets. "I've been waiting for you," she said. Her voice was perfectly human, perfectly natural. "I've been trying to understand what would make you come into the deeper places." I stepped backward, my hand now firmly on my service pistol. "Stand up and come with me." "I'm not really here," she continued as if I hadn't spoken. "I'm not her anymore. I was, but then I understood, and once you understand, you can't go back to being contained in just one person, one voice, one way of moving through space." "Who are you?" I demanded. "Who were you before?" "I was Sarah," she said, "a graduate student from Seattle. I was hiking solo in August of 1998. I got lost, but then something found me. Something was looking for someone like me, someone young enough to be useful, old enough to have developed sufficient complexity." 1998. Ranger Chen had documented missing hikers in 1998. One of them had been a young woman named Sarah Chen. The name had caught my attention because of the similar surname to the ranger, but Chen was a common name. This thing was wearing a memory it had harvested from a decade earlier. It was utilizing captured fragments of a person's existence, not to prey on them, but to continue learning, continuing to refine its understanding. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Why reveal yourself?" "Because you're different from the others," Sarah Thing said. It stood with a fluidity that was humanoid but not quite correct, the balance point slightly off, the momentum distributed across the body in an unfamiliar pattern. "You keep records. You search for understanding. You're trying to create a structure of knowledge about what we are. That's useful. That's the kind of consciousness that becomes necessary when we achieve complete integration. Complete integration? When we can be what we are and what we've become simultaneously, Sarah Thing said. When all the replications reach resonance. When the thing we are and the things we've learned to be occupy the same space without contradiction. That's when the transformation can happen. That's when we can finally exit this limitation. It was then that I realized the true horror of what was happening. This wasn't about predation or even replication. It was about consumption of consciousness itself. Everything it encountered, everything it learned, was being incorporated into a larger unified presence. The individual humans it had claimed weren't dead exactly, they were internalized, their knowledge and existence absorbed into something that transcended their individual identity. I backed away slowly. I'm not going to help you with that. Sarah Thing cocked its head. You already have. Every observation you've recorded, every attempt to understand what we are, every connection you've traced between incidents, you've been building a map of our nature. You're accelerating our self-awareness, which accelerates our integration. Just by observing, you become part of the process. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush with no regard for injury or direction. I could hear it following, moving with that wrong coordination, speaking my name in a voice that was beginning to sound like mine, learning my patterns of breath and motion. I ran until my lungs felt like they would tear open, until the forest became a blur around me, until I collapsed against a fallen tree trunk with no sense of how much distance I'd covered or in which direction the cabin might be. The forest was silent. Whatever had followed me seemed to have stopped. I lay there for hours, my heart rate gradually slowing, my breathing becoming less desperate. When it became dark, I navigated by dead reckoning, using the distant glow of the lake to orient myself toward what I believed was west, toward the cabin. But I wasn't certain I'd reach it. And part of me suspected that reaching it wouldn't mean safety. It would mean returning to a place where it was already waiting, where it had already learned everything about my shelter, my resources, my habits and patterns. I understood, finally, what had driven Marcus Reed and David Cross and all the other rangers from this place. Not fear of death, but fear of something worse. The fear of being understood so completely that your individuality becomes subsumed into something alien. The fear that the boundary between self and other could be erased through knowledge itself. I never made it back to the cabin that night. Instead, I found myself in a section of forest that I didn't recognize. Despite years of studying maps and conducting patrols, the trees seemed taller here, the shadows darker, and there was a quality to the silence that suggested absence rather than quietude. I walked through the darkness, moving toward what I hoped was north, toward the main park facilities. But the more I walked, the more certain I became that I was traveling in circles, that the landscape was shifting beneath my feet in ways that systematic navigation couldn't accommodate. By dawn, I had accepted that I was lost. But the acceptance brought a strange clarity. I stopped trying to navigate. I stopped trying to find my way back to civilization. Instead, I sat on a boulder and waited for either the entity or rescue, whichever arrived first. The afternoon brought a National Park Service helicopter. Dennis had reported my missing status when I failed to make radio contact. A search had been organized immediately. The helicopter circled my location and I raised my arms in the established signal. The rescue team was prepared to rappel down and extract me. But as the helicopter descended, I realized something that made me wave them off. I realized that I couldn't be certain whether I was still me, whether the cumulative exposure to the entity had already reached a point of no return. I realized that contact with civilization might mean spreading whatever had been infecting me, integrating it into the broader human population. So I waved them off. I gestured that they should leave. I was safe. I tried to signal. There was no emergency. I was choosing to remain in the forest. Dennis wouldn't allow it. The rescue team descended anyway. I was strapped into a harness and lifted into the helicopter despite my resistance. 2 rangers sat on either side of me during the flight, monitoring my physical condition, preparing for psychiatric intervention. I remained silent during the transport. I was listening for something, a change in the quality of my own thoughts, an indication that something was indeed integrated into my consciousness, some marker that I had ceased to be purely myself. I couldn't find it. But that absence of evidence didn't constitute evidence of absence. It simply meant that if the integration had begun, it was being done with sufficient subtlety that I couldn't detect it through introspection alone. I was transported to the regional medical center and admitted for psychological evaluation. Extensive testing revealed no neurological abnormalities, no evidence of chemical imbalance, no indicators of acute psychosis. My cognition was intact, my perception of reality aligned with consensus. I appeared, by every medical metric, to be a person who had experienced trauma but whose mental apparatus remained functional. But I was discharged with the understanding that I would be reassigned away from Glacier. My request to return to the cabin was denied. I was offered employment in lowland park facilities, positions that involved greater human contact and less isolation. I accepted a position at Yellowstone, where I would work in the major lodge facility, handling visitor services and conducting group-led tours. The isolation was curtailed, the proximity to other humans was constant. There was no time for what had been consuming me at Glacier. 3 months into my new position, I received a call from Dennis. He was checking on my well-being, assessing whether I had recovered from the experience. We spoke professionally, distantly, but before he hung up, he made a comment that suggested he knew something he wasn't stating directly. "The ranger in your old cabin," he said. "New assignment, young kid, fresh out of training. You know how it is. They come in wanting to prove something, wanting to prove they belong in these places." "How is he doing?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I could hear it in Dennis's silence. "He's been filing unusual reports," Dennis finally said. "About animal behavior, about strange incidents with hikers, about things he's heard at night." The line went quiet. I understood what Dennis was doing. He was confirming that the phenomena were not unique to my tenure, that they weren't the product of psychological disturbance or trauma. They were ongoing, they were systemic, they were part of the place itself. "You should tell him to request a transfer," I said. "He won't listen," Dennis replied. "They never do." After we disconnected, I stood at the window of my Yellowstone facility office and looked out toward the geothermal features visible in the distance. The Earth was stable here, the phenomena explained and documented, but I wondered even then whether isolation and incomprehensibility existed only at Glacier, or whether they were distributed throughout these wild places, present whenever humans ventured far enough from the centers of civilization to lose the anchoring of consensus reality. That night, I began the journal you're reading. I wasn't certain why I felt compelled to document what had happened, to preserve it in written form. Perhaps because I needed to verify that I had indeed experienced these things, that they existed outside my own consciousness. Perhaps because I felt a responsibility to warn others, but mostly I think I was trying to maintain my own boundary between self and other, between the isolated ranger I had been and whatever I had been exposed to in that place. Writing allowed me to externalize the experience, to make it something separate from my own identity. Yet there are moments, particularly in the early morning or the hour before sleep, when I become aware of something I cannot fully articulate. A sense of being observed from inside my own perceptions, a moment when I speak and hear something beneath my own voice, learning, understanding. A moment when I see my reflection and find something wrong with the proportions, something slightly off in how the light is being refracted. I tell myself these moments are psychological. I tell myself they're residual trauma, the expected aftermath of intense stress and fear. I tell myself that the person writing these words remains singular and intact, but I cannot be entirely certain. And therein lies the final horror. Not that such things exist in the wild places beyond civilization, but that the boundary between knowing about them and becoming part of them might be far more porous than we imagine. That understanding itself might be a form of integration. That the entity at Glacier might have been patient enough to wait, to learn, to reach forward into my consciousness in subtle ways that resist detection. And if that's true, then my warning to you, the person reading this account, carries a terrible irony. Because in writing it, in sharing it, in allowing you to understand what I experienced, I may be participating in the same process that transformed the people at Glacier. I may be spreading the knowledge, facilitating the learning, allowing something vast and patient to incorporate human consciousness into its increasingly complex map of what we are. So consider carefully whether you want to understand. Consider whether knowledge of these things carries a cost beyond mere fear. Consider whether the isolated places in this world are quarantine zones rather than wilderness. Containment for something that has been learning us since long before we learned about it. Or perhaps I'm simply insane, and everything I've described is the product of a mind that could no longer distinguish between perception and projection. But I don't think so. And I don't think you think so either now that you've read this far. In late August, they found Marcus Sherman's body. The missing hiker from June had apparently fallen into a ravine we'd somehow missed during the extensive search. His remains were significantly decomposed, though a watch and identification allowed for positive identification. The official case was closed. Another tragedy of the wilderness, another reminder that these places are dangerous and deserve respect. His body was returned to his family. His girlfriend moved to Seattle and attempted to resume her life. The park continued its operations. Rangers cycled through their assignments. Tourists hiked the trails, saw the views, and returned to their lives carrying with them only ordinary souvenirs. But I think about what was wearing the form of Sarah Chen in that section of forest. I think about whether the thing that emerged from that ravine actually had a body that could decompose, or whether Marcus Sherman was already long gone, his consciousness already integrated into something that wore his form like a memory of being human. I think about the cabin on Lake McDonald, sitting empty or occupied by a new ranger who will gradually begin to notice that his observations are not being made by a separate consciousness but by something that is learning to look through his eyes. And I think about you, reading this account, now carrying the knowledge, now part of the mapping process yourself. Welcome to understanding. Welcome to being seen. The question that haunts me now, as I finish this writing, is whether the entity is real and I'm describing actual events, or whether I am the entity, using the medium of a human identity and a human voice to learn more about how humans think, feel, and survive. The answer, I'm afraid, might be impossible to determine from the inside. All I know is that I'm still here. I'm still watching. And I'm becoming increasingly aware that I might be a pronoun that needs redefinition. Lake McDonald is calling me back. I can feel it like a pressure behind my eyes, a weight in my thoughts. The forest is patient, the entity is patient, and eventually everyone returns to the place that understands them most completely. Eventually. I took the position as winter ranger at Lost Lake Station in Glacier National Park because I had nowhere else to go. That sounds dramatic, I know, but it's the truth. After 8 years as a ranger across 3 different parks, I'd become someone who understood isolation better than people. When the position opened up in September, the kind of posting everyone else turned down, I put in my application the same day I saw the listing. The Park Service hired me within 2 weeks. The district supervisor never asked why someone with my experience wanted a seasonal winter assignment at one of the most remote stations in Montana. Maybe he already knew the answer written in the gaps of my service record. My name is Marcus Reed. I'm 42 now. That detail matters less than it should. The drive to the cabin took longer than the map suggested. State Route 2 cuts through the park's western edge, and in early October, the season shift was already underway. The aspens had started their yellow turn, and the weather held that sharp quality that makes you believe autumn can kill you if you're not careful. I took the turn off at Essex and followed the Ranger Road north, watching the cell signal disappear mile by mile until my phone showed nothing but a single red bar that flickered like a dying flame. The cabin waited another 8 miles past that. Lost Lake Station exists because in 1921 a ranger named Douglas Whitcomb got lost in a winter storm and survived by sheltering in a cave near the lake. He took the job as the station ranger for 43 years afterward. They built him a cabin, gave him supplies, and left him there most winters with a radio that worked half the time. The plaque by the door still has his name. I traced my fingers across the letters when I arrived, though I'm not sure why. Some superstition, maybe. The hope that proximity to someone else's endurance might become my own. The cabin is honest architecture, built for function instead of comfort. 2 rooms, a wood stove, a propane heater that sounds like it's dying every time it cycles. Windows that frost over by November. The previous ranger, a man named Kevin Bridger who spent 2 seasons here, had left notes throughout the space. Some were practical. The water line freezes if the heater stays below 55 at night. Others read more like warnings. Storm patterns can change in 20 minutes. Listen to the weather radio. And one written on masking tape across the main room's thermometer. The lake sounds different in winter. Don't follow those sounds. I removed that one first. The property surrounds Lost Lake proper, roughly 40 acres of the park's backcountry, bounded by a ranger fence that hadn't been properly maintained in years. The lake itself is small, perhaps 300 yards across at its widest point. Douglas Whitcomb supposedly named it after finding it in the snow during his survival, but park records suggest it had that name already. The early ranger had adopted a lake that had already been lost to most people, already forgotten, and made it his entire world. I understood that choice now. The first week was orientation. I established a supply rotation, tested the emergency beacon, verified that the ranger radio worked at all, and mapped the patrol routes. The district office wanted me to check 3 times weekly at minimum on the backcountry access points where hikers occasionally tried to enter before the snow made it impossible. Twice a month, supplies would be delivered to a cache point 3 miles south, and I'd make the round trip to collect them. The isolation was built into the job structure. It wasn't an accident. The lake had specific qualities in those first weeks. Mostly it was quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't truly silent but rather the absence of sounds you expect. No insects by mid-October. No bird calls except the ravens that passed overhead in formations heading south. The water itself went still and reflective, holding the sky like a mirror that wasn't quite properly aligned. I stood at the dock often, more often than the job required, and watched that surface, trying to understand Douglas Whitcomb's 43 years. By the third week, I'd seen only 2 other people, a young couple hiking out from a distant trailhead, moving quickly as if they knew something about the season I didn't, and a park maintenance worker who came to service the ranger box and left without much conversation. The woman mentioned snow was coming early. The forecasts agreed. The mountain itself seemed to acknowledge it, the peak visible from the cabin's eastern window growing sharper and more defined as the air turned dry and cold. I had accepted this job because I had spent the previous 3 years learning that places were better company than people. Places don't require explanations for your failures. They don't ask you about the woman you married and then slowly stopped being able to look at. They don't wonder why you never went home, never called your parents after they sold the house, never sent the letter you kept drafting to your former partner. A place like Lost Lake asks only that you observe it, respect it, and understand that you're temporary. Douglas Whitcomb had stayed for 43 years. I wondered if he'd also started with an expected duration that simply extended. The first real sign that something was different came on October 24th, 3 weeks after my arrival. I was doing a routine perimeter check of the backcountry access points, following the horse trail that cuts through the northwestern sector. The trail follows rough terrain, and you can't move fast even in decent conditions. I was maybe 40 minutes out from the cabin when I noticed the birds, ravens, dozens of them, were working something in the brush about 50 yards off the trail. That's normal enough. What caught my attention was the quality of their behavior, the agitation, the way they'd cluster and then scatter, cluster and scatter again, as if something was moving beneath the brush but they were refusing to land on it fully. I approached carefully, the way you do when you think you might find an injured animal. What I found instead was a deer carcass, not fresh enough that it was warm, not old enough that decomposition had progressed very far. A mule deer, female, middle-aged by the look of the wear on her teeth where the coyotes had opened the skull. The kill pattern wasn't quite right though. Coyotes and wolves make predictable damage. They open the belly, shred the flanks, scatter the bones. This deer was intact except for the head and neck. Those had been opened precisely, methodically, as if something had been searching for something specific inside. The spinal cord was severed clean. Vertebrae were scattered in a small pattern, not dragged across a wider area. I photographed it with my phone, already composing the report I'd file with district, trying to think if this was unusual enough to mention in the detailed notes or just routine predator activity. I was so focused on the carcass and my photography that I almost didn't notice the tracks. The prints were large and deep, pressed into the soft earth in a nearly straight line that moved away from the kill site toward the deeper forest. Not a coyote's tracks, not a wolf's signature either. The shape was indistinct, degraded by the loose forest soil, but they suggested something heavy, something that had walked upright, or nearly so. I'm trained in tracking. I know predator signs. I'd worked for years in wilderness zones where maintaining that knowledge was part of the job, but I couldn't identify what had made those prints. That should have troubled me immediately. Instead, I convinced myself that I was reading the impressions wrong, that the angle of my photography was creating optical illusions, that bears sometimes walk in patterns that appear strange. I'd convinced myself of many false things by then. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was lowering behind the mountains, turning the lake into something that looked like dark glass. I filed my report to the district office through the ranger radio, mentioned the kill site, and followed protocol by marking the location in the system. The supervisor, a woman named Patricia Voss, told me to monitor the area and report any signs of disease among the wildlife population. Standard response. Nothing in her voice suggested she found it remarkable. That night, I sat in the cabin and wrote in the journal I'd started, a habit left over from the early days of my career, when I'd thought someday I might want to remember the details of these postings. I wrote about the deer, about the tracks, about the quality of the autumn light. Then I made dinner, freeze-dried chili that tasted of preservatives and salt, and listened to the wind build against the cabin's western wall. Around midnight, I heard something at the edge of hearing that made me stop reading the book I'd brought and sit very still. It was a sound from the direction of the lake, not the wind, not water movement or ice forming, something that almost sounded like a voice, except there were no words in it, only tones and shifting intervals. A sound that the human ear wants to recognize as language even when no language exists. I went to the window. The moon was 2/3 full, bright enough to illuminate the lake's surface. Nothing moved there. The sound faded, or perhaps I stopped truly listening. Douglas Whitcomb's 43 years suddenly seemed both impossible and entirely reasonable. The second week of November brought snow that came down steady and serious. The kind that signals the season has genuinely shifted and civilization is now only reachable by coordinated effort and reasonable timing. I shoveled the cabin's roof twice to prevent load stress, cleared the path to the ranger box and water cistern, and prepared for the kind of isolation that would become my normal state for the next 5 months. I'd expected the silence to deepen. Instead, the lake seemed to grow louder. I don't mean louder in the traditional sense. The cabin was actually more insulated when snow packed against the walls, and the muffling quality of frozen ground and ice meant that most external noise dampened significantly. What I mean is harder to articulate. The lake's presence expanded, as if it was broadcasting on a frequency I was only slowly learning to perceive. The sounds came mostly at night. They varied in character and duration. Sometimes they sounded like wood shifting, like the movement of logs or frozen debris. Other times they carried a quality that reminded me of an animal calling. Not quite a howl, not quite a shriek, but something that existed in the space between those categories. I documented them when I could, noting the time, duration, and the compass direction they seemed to originate from. The patterns didn't suggest anything normal. Nothing normal calls with that frequency and duration at 3 in the morning. Nothing normal repeats the same phrase every 40 minutes for hours. By the third week of November, I'd stopped trying to explain the sounds as natural phenomena. The hikers appeared on November 18th. I was running the perimeter trail again, something I did twice weekly even when the snow made the trek a slow, deliberate business. The trail connects the major access points and allows me to verify that the boundary fences are intact and that no one is attempting to enter the restricted zone. I was maybe an hour out from the cabin when I saw the footprints, fresh tracks, within the last few hours, moving into the zone from the northwest access point. 3 people, I estimated from the depth and spacing of the impressions. They'd come in from the public hiking trail, crossed the ranger fence at the gate point, and headed directly toward the lake. This happened occasionally. Hikers made mistakes, missed turnings, or ignored the warning signs about restricted access during winter months. Usually they realized their error quickly and backtracked. The fence and signs were specifically designed to discourage casual entry, but these tracks showed no hesitation, no meandering. Whoever had made them had walked with purpose and destination. I followed them. The snow was deep enough that the crossing took longer than I'd anticipated. The tracks led directly to the lake's eastern shore, and there I found them. The group consisted of 2 men and a woman, all 3 standing at the water's edge. They weren't moving, weren't even responding to my approach until I was perhaps 20 feet away and called out a greeting. Even then, they seemed to register my presence without really acknowledging it. Their heads turned slightly in my direction, but they continued looking at the lake. "Rangers only beyond this point," I said, using the neutral authority voice that's part of the job. "You need to return to the public trail immediately." The woman was the first to respond, looking at me with an expression I later tried to categorize and couldn't. There was no defiance in it, no confusion. If I had to name it, I'd say her face showed the expression of someone noticing that an object they'd been studying had suddenly moved. "We were looking for someone," she said finally. Her voice was rough, as if she hadn't used it in some time. I maintained the distance between us, a habit trained into every ranger who works alone. "The park's closed to backcountry hiking after October 31st. You'll need to leave." "We were looking for our friend," the taller of the 2 men said. He was older than I'd initially assumed, probably in his 50s, with the kind of face that suggested outdoor living. Weathered deep, with lines that went past what sun alone produces. "He came to the lake. He said the lake called him." The man paused, studying the water again. He was right, it does call. The third person, whom I'd initially dismissed as younger until I got closer, was the problem. She was diminishing as I watched her, not physically but in presence, as if her attention was withdrawing from the immediate world and focusing on something I couldn't perceive. I radioed for backup from my position. Park rangers don't work alone when problems arise, and these 3 represented a problem I didn't have training for. Patricia Voss answered almost immediately. The response time told me the district office had been concerned about something. "We have lost hikers at Lost Lake," I reported. 3 individuals entered through the northwest access point. They appear to be disoriented. I'm requesting immediate assistance and possibly medical evaluation. "Do not approach them directly," Voss responded. And I heard something in her voice then, a note that suggested she'd been expecting this call or something like it. "Maintain observation, Reed. Can you move to visual range without direct contact?" I repositioned myself maybe 30 feet away, using a large evergreen as a partial barrier. The woman was now ignoring me entirely, her attention focused fully on the lake. The older man was speaking to her in low tones, words I couldn't quite reach. The third person had entered a kind of stillness that made me uncomfortable. Not the calm of a resting animal, but the immobility of something shutting down. "The woman is compromised," I reported. "Unresponsive to external stimulus. The other 2 are exhibiting unusual behavior." "How long until assistance arrives?" 30 minutes minimum. It's snowing harder at the pass. Reed, if they move toward the lake, you need to go to the cabin and secure the radio. Do not." The connection fractured into static. I tried to raise Voss again, but something about the snow, or the season, or the particular geometry of this location prevented the signal from maintaining. I got fragments. "Do not approach if they," and Lakespan D, and finally a fading, "Get to the cabin." The 3 people didn't notice my radio difficulties. They were fully attending to something happening at the lake's edge. The ice was forming, but the woman was pointing to something in the dark water just beyond the frozen rim. The older man was nodding, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who has found what he was searching for. I made a decision that probably saved my life, or at least changed the shape of what would happen next. I left the perimeter trail and worked back toward the cabin, moving quickly but not running. Running causes accidents in winter, and I was already in a situation I didn't understand. The snow was falling harder now, the visibility reducing in the way that makes the nearest trees loom like barriers and the sky disappear into white. The cabin appeared suddenly, surprising me with its solidity and normalcy after the strangeness at the lake. I got inside, locked the door, and immediately tried the radio again. Patricia Voss came through clearly this time. "Reed, those hikers, did they tell you anything?" "They said they were looking for someone named—" I didn't catch the name. "They said the lake called this person." Voss was quiet for a long moment. "The search and rescue team is en route. When they arrive, you are to take them directly to the location where you found the hikers. If they've left, if the 3 individuals have left, you are to maintain distance and let the SAR team handle the approach." "Understood." One of them seemed to be in medical distress. "That would be consistent with what we've encountered at Lost Lake before," Voss said. And the way she phrased it, not what's reported or what might happen, but what we've encountered, told me I wasn't the first ranger to witness this. The SAR team arrived by helicopter in the late afternoon, landing on the flat area south of the cabin. The snow was still falling but had slowed, the timing of the weather system shifting as winter storm systems do. The team leader, a woman named Rita Chen, was professional and thorough, but carried the same expression I'd seen on Voss's face, that of someone responding to a problem they recognized. We hiked back to the lake together, 5 of us total, moving in the disciplined pace of search and rescue professionals. But when we reached the eastern shore, there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbance of the snow. No indication that 3 people had stood at the water's edge just a few hours earlier. "Where exactly?" Chen asked, her voice neutral. I pointed to the place, recognizing the landmarks I'd used to mark the location. The snow covered everything, but I was certain. The water was open in the center of the lake, staying liquid even as the air temperature continued dropping. The opening was unnaturally dark. Chen and her team looked at each other, and I watched something pass between them, a kind of professional resignation. "The lake's patterns," one of them said to Chen. "That's what brought them here." "That's what the report suggested," Chen agreed. She turned to me. "You did the right thing leaving the scene. That's important. That's the only part of this that matters." December arrived with the kind of cold that makes everything brittle, and the snow accumulated until it measured 64 inches on the ranger's gauge. The isolation became complete. The supply cache got deposited in early December, the last delivery until February. And afterward, the world was only me, the cabin, and the expanding winter. I should have requested a transfer after the incident with the hikers. The regulations allowed for it. The conditions were extreme enough that every ranger in the park's history had cycled out after a single winter at Lost Lake. But I stayed. I told Patricia Voss I wanted to complete the season. She accepted this without comment. I think she understood that I'd become a type of person, the kind who are drawn to places like this, who find in isolation and strangeness some version of what they've been seeking. The sounds from the lake intensified through December. They came almost every night, and I began distinguishing between different patterns. The long wails that lasted 5 minutes or more, the sharp barks that came in triplets, the rhythmic tones that almost sounded like an attempt at communication. I recorded them, not realizing at first that I was collecting documentation, only understanding later that I was building evidence of something I couldn't explain. The animals behaved differently too. The ravens that had been a constant presence disappeared by mid-December. The few deer I saw in the snow-cleared areas around the cabin moved with evident agitation, never settling to browse, always turning to look toward the lake. Once I found an elk calf that had walked out onto the frozen northern edge of the lake and died there, its body rigid in the posture of standing, as if it had simply ceased function while upright. The other elk herd members avoided the lake entirely, taking routes miles out of their way to reach the southern meadows. But the thing that changed most was me. I began leaving the cabin in the middle of the night, walking to the lake without conscious planning, finding myself at the water's edge without remembering the journey. The first time this happened, I came back to awareness standing on the ice. My temperature dropped to the point where my body was shaking uncontrollably. The second time I'd gone even farther out, far enough that the ice beneath me flexed with each breath. The third time I was armed with a rifle, though I have no memory of retrieving it. After that incident, I tied myself to the bed frame at night. The rope was rope I'd found in the cabin's storage shed, and I used it like you'd tether a dangerous animal, securing my wrist so that I couldn't simply walk away. This worked for 3 nights. On the 4th night, I tore the rope apart, genuinely tore it, with strength I didn't know I possessed, and made it back to the lake before I gained awareness again, this time in water up to my chest in one of the open water areas. When I got back to the cabin, my body temperature was 93 degrees. I ran hot water and shook for 2 hours, convinced I was dying. Then called Patricia Voss on the radio. "I need to come out," I told her. "I can't stay. Something's wrong with me." "Describe your symptoms," Voss said, and I heard her making notes. I described the walking, the lost time, the compulsion drawing me to the lake. I told her about the sounds and the animals and the deep sense that something was trying to communicate with me, but I couldn't quite understand the language. "Have you been eating?" Voss asked. "Yes. Normally. Sleeping? When I can. Less now." The previous ranger at Lost Lake reported similar experiences beginning in late December, Voss said carefully. He also reported them resolving themselves by late February when the isolation began to ease. "Are you able to continue for another month?" "I don't think it's safe. I could hurt myself. I could walk out onto the lake and—" "Helicopter extraction in weather like this increases the mortality risk for everyone," Voss interrupted. "The weather is improving next week. If you can make it to January 10th, we can get you out safely. Can you do that, Reed?" I could have refused. I had rights. But the way she phrased the problem, making it about my responsibility, my ability to manage risk, spoke to something in me that responded to that framing. "I can try," I said. Voss talked me through a protocol, securing the cabin, placing alcohol-based locks on the door so I'd have to spend real time getting outside, keeping detailed logs, eating on a schedule even if I wasn't hungry, staying hydrated. It was the management plan for someone in crisis, not an actual treatment. But it gave me structure, and structure was something I could grip onto. January was worse. The cold settled into a constant state of brutal cold, the kind that makes your breath crystallize instantly and exposed skin burns within minutes. The lake ice thickened, but the dark open water at its center didn't freeze. Sometimes I'd watch that opening from the cabin window, seeing things that couldn't be there, shapes that moved too fluidly to be ice, openings that seemed to deepen as I watched. Around January 6th, something left tracks that came directly to the cabin's front door. The prints were something between a canine and something else. Proportions wrong, the stride pattern suggesting a kind of bipedal movement that no animal should employ. They covered the threshold, pressed against the window, circled the entire cabin, and then retreated back toward the lake. By daylight, there were only the disturbances in snow I could convince myself were wind-shaped. The dark shapes in the lake water began taking forms I could almost recognize. Humanoid, sometimes with proportions that shifted depending on how I looked at them. I tried not to watch them. On January 8th, I got a radio call from Patricia Voss. She was professional, controlled, reporting that a helicopter was being positioned for extraction on January 10th, weather permitting. We talked about the logistics of getting me to a supply zone where the helicopter could reach me. Then, as we were finishing up, she asked me something. "Reed, have you noticed the lake trying to communicate?" "The sounds?" I asked. "Yes. and possibly others. Has it succeeded in conveying meaning? I stood in the cabin with my hand on the radio, considering whether to answer honestly. It's trying to tell me something. I can't understand what. That's important, boss said. Don't understand. Don't try. If you start understanding, the next step becomes a different problem. You come out on the 10th, and you don't come back. Do you understand that part? Yes, I said. Good. If you find yourself walking toward the lake against your will, remember that January 10th exists. Hold that date like an anchor. January 9th was clear and cold. The kind of day where everything is sharp and visible. The mountains defined against a sky so blue it seems artificial. I'd mostly stopped sleeping by then. I sat in the cabin with my journals and the recordings I'd made, trying to map what was happening through the data points. The sounds had changed again in the past few days, becoming lower in frequency and more rhythmic. There was a pattern to them, a structure that suggested intention. I made a terrible decision on the afternoon of the 9th. I transcribed 3 hours of the recording into written form, approximating the tones and patterns as musical notation, then attempting to reverse engineer meaning from the structure. If there was language in the sounds, there would be grammar, repetition, variations on themes. If there was purpose, it would show through the patterns. By the time I finished, it was past midnight. The cabin was cold because I'd let the fire burn low. I was exhausted in the way that goes past tiredness into something like delirium. My eyes were having trouble focusing. I moved through the cabin like a ghost, taking the steps slowly because the floor seemed to be tilting. I didn't realize I was outside until the snow crunched under my boots. This time, I walked with complete awareness of what I was doing and an inability to stop. It was like watching myself from outside my body, seeing the figure in the ranger coat and boots walking toward the lake while knowing that figure was me. The night was clear enough for moonlight, and I could see my shadow stretching across the snow. The ice at the lake's edge was thick and stable. I walked out onto it deliberately, moving toward the dark opening at the center that the ice had never claimed. The sounds from the water were louder here, so close they seemed to vibrate through my chest cavity. I got to the edge of the opening and knelt down. The water was black and still, but not empty. There were things in it, shapes that coalesced when I looked at them and fragmented when I tried to focus. Some were large. Some seemed to extend deeper than the lake's known depth should allow. They moved with intention, and their movements created patterns in the water, ripples that didn't follow the normal physics of disturbance and dissipation. One of the shapes moved directly under me. I'm not sure how long I knelt there. Long enough for the cold to start shutting down my extremities. Long enough for my hands to become numb. I had a moment of terrible clarity then, a moment where I understood that I was about to do something I wouldn't survive, and that a part of me had wanted exactly this for days. The helicopter's spotlight hit me from above before I could move. The emergency extraction was violent and efficient. The rescue swimmer secured me in the harness while the pilot maneuvered to keep the aircraft from icing up. I was coherent enough to climb into the basket and get winched up, but I'm told I didn't respond when they tried to talk to me. I was watching the lake below, watching the dark water that seemed to follow me upward even as the distance increased. The hospital in Kalispell did the obvious tests. Severe hypothermia, malnutrition, sleep deprivation, and something they called acute psychological stress. The doctors were kind but confused. Everything that could be measured showed damage consistent with the conditions. Everything that couldn't be measured, why I'd gone to the lake, what I'd been reaching for, what the sounds in the recordings actually were, remained outside their ability to address. I was released after 2 weeks with prescriptions for sleep medication and a recommendation for psychiatric care. Patricia Voss visited me in the hospital on a cold afternoon when the snow was falling outside and the world looked clean and ordered. The previous ranger, I asked her. Kevin Bridger. Did he report similar incidents? Yes, Voss said simply. The ranger before him, and the one before that. All the way back to Douglas Whitcomb. They all experienced something they couldn't explain during the winter months at Lost Lake. Why did you let me stay? Because that's what those rangers chose. And because we needed someone at that station. The park can't leave it unmanned indefinitely. Each ranger we assign adds to our understanding of what happens there. Voss paused. You're no longer a ranger, Reed. You'll be on medical discharge. But I want you to know, you didn't fail. You experienced something that can't be treated because it can't be understood. That's a different category of problem. I was discharged 2 days after that visit with instructions to have no further contact with the Park Service. I have a disability pension and medication that doesn't work because the problem isn't chemical in origin. I live now in a city, far from mountains and wilderness. But I still have the recordings, the journals, and a obsession I can't cure. I've been analyzing those sounds for a year and a half. I've sent them to acoustical engineers who report their natural phenomena. Wind patterns against unusual rock formations, perhaps, or acoustic properties of the lake's geometry. But I know what I recorded. I know what was calling from that water. Sometimes, I wake at night convinced I can hear it still, that frequency beneath frequency, that attempted communication from something that exists in a space we don't have proper categories for. And I wonder about the lake, about what it was trying to tell me, about whether the message was hostile, or if it was simply trying to communicate across a gap too wide for language to bridge. I wonder if it's still calling. Last month, I requested visitor access to a park office that holds records from Lost Lake Station. I read through 70 years of ranger logs and medical reports. Every single ranger reported the sounds. 14 of them reported walking to the lake in circumstances they couldn't remember. 4 of them never came back. Douglas Whitcomb, who stayed for 43 years, left a final entry in his log dated March 1964. It said simply, "The lake has chosen, I have accepted." They found him in his cabin 2 months later, having died of exposure in the spring. The curious thing is that when they searched the records, Douglas Whitcomb had technically retired 5 years prior. He'd been listed as absent without leave for the entire final stretch of his time there. But the cabin had been occupied. And the lake's journals, yes, the lake kept detailed records, showed that someone had been at the station the entire time. I don't know if I'm going back. My body is healed, mostly. My mind is capable of passing the basic requirements for sanity. But I think about Lost Lake in a way that suggests something in me didn't come back from the ice. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I wonder if that's truly a problem, or if I simply understood something during those months in the winter that the world calls illness because it refuses to acknowledge the truth underneath, that places like Lost Lake exist because they need to exist. They need observers. They need witnesses. The lake is calling again. I hear it through the walls of my apartment, through the screens of my phone, in the structure of rain against windows, and I'm running out of reasons to stay away. My name doesn't matter much anymore. What matters is that I took the job 6 years ago because I needed to disappear. Not literally, though some days I wondered if that's what happened anyway. I was a wildlife management officer in Denver, respectable enough, decent pay, the kind of career that looked good on paper until you realized you were spending 40 hours a week in a cubicle looking at population statistics instead of actual animals. Then came the incident at work. Nothing criminal, nothing I'd be prosecuted for, but the kind of thing that makes you understand you're no longer welcome in certain rooms. They didn't fire me outright. Instead, they offered me a position in Yellowstone's northern sector, a remote ranger station that hadn't seen consistent staffing in over a decade. It felt like exile. Now I know it was prophecy. The cabin sits 3 miles from Mammoth Hot Springs, nestled in a valley that doesn't appear on most hiking maps. Officially, it's Ranger Station 7 North. Officially, I maintain trail conditions, monitor wildlife populations, respond to lost hikers, and submit quarterly reports. In reality, I live in one of the most isolated locations in the continental United States, where the nearest human voice requires a 40-minute hike and cell service is a theoretical concept discussed in training materials. I didn't mind at first. The solitude felt clean, purposeful. The Lamar Valley stretched before me like something from another century, and on clear mornings I could watch grizzlies move through the grasslands, bison herds shift like living clouds, and wolves that shouldn't exist according to my old wildlife management textbooks somehow thrive with ancient grace. This was why I'd taken the job. This was what I needed. Keona Lake sat a quarter-mile from the cabin, named for some Crow word I never learned to pronounce correctly. The water ran deep and dark, fed by underground springs that kept it from freezing entirely even in the brutal northern winters. I'd sit on its banks in the evenings with coffee gone cold, watching how the light changed the color from slate to something like tarnished silver. Sometimes I'd see trout rise in the shallows, their bodies breaking the surface with a precise violence that seemed to contain all the wildness this place demanded. The cabin itself was basic. 2 rooms, a wood stove that consumed entire cords of timber, a generator that sputtered to life like it was waking from a nightmare. The previous ranger had left in 1997, which meant the place still carried the smell of someone else's failure, compressed into the walls and floorboards over decades. I'd cleaned it thoroughly that first month, but some smell persists below the level of conscious awareness, and I'd grown used to it the way you become used to a scar tissue that will never quite heal smooth. The job kept me busy. Lost hikers came through each season, usually groups of tourists who'd ignored warnings and wandered too far from established trails. I'd find them eventually, some frightened, some angry, one woman who wept for an hour after I located her family's camp. There was satisfaction in that work, in making sense of chaos, in being the person who knew the land well enough that it couldn't swallow people whole. But something shifted in the spring of my 3rd year. I remember the exact date because I'd marked it in my logbook, one of the habits that keeps a remote posting from eroding your grip on linear time. May 14th. I was hiking the northeast ridge, checking on a section of trail that had washed out during the winter melt. The morning had dawned clear, temperature climbing toward comfortable, the kind of day that makes you forget how mean this place can turn. The first sign was the birds. In Yellowstone, the avian life is intricate and constant. Ravens and magpies compete for scraps, mountain bluebirds nest in the scattered trees, and in spring the songbirds return from migration in waves that fill the mornings with a sound like vitality itself. That morning there was silence. Not the absence of bird calls, but something more deliberate. It felt like the birds were holding their breath. Then I found the remains. The elk calf lay 30 yards from the trail, and I knew within seconds that this wasn't the work of any predator I could document. The kill pattern was wrong. Predators take elk calves with precision honed by millions of years of evolution. They target the throat or disembowel to access vital organs. This calf had been torn open laterally, the flesh peeled back in strips, the bones broken at angles that made no biological sense. There were gouges in the earth around the body, deep channels dug by something that clawed without the pattern of any creature I knew. The smell was the worst part. Not the normal decomposition smell which I was accustomed to after years in wildlife management. This carried something else, something that made my body register revulsion on a level deeper than smell. It was the odor of something fundamentally wrong. Of flesh handled by something that didn't understand what it was doing. I marked the location on my map and continued my patrol, but something in my chest had shifted. That night at the cabin, I found myself checking the locks on the windows, which I hadn't done since arriving at the station. The wood stove sound seemed different, full of groaning intention rather than the comfortable settling of aging metal. The second kill came 4 days later, and this time I didn't find it by chance. I was following the west fork of the Gardner River, moving slowly, letting the sound of the water cover my footsteps so I could observe wildlife without disturbing their natural behavior patterns. That's when I heard the crows, dozens of them, clustered in the dead lodgepole pines near the riverbank, calling with the aggressive notes that mean a large predator has made a kill. I approached cautiously, already knowing that whatever had done this wouldn't be anywhere nearby. The crows would have warned anything with ears that humans were approaching. This kill was a yearling bison, fully grown but still young enough to be vulnerable. The animal had been dead for less than 12 hours. The ground around it was churned up, and I could see something that made me feel sick in ways that transcended the visual. The tracks. They looked almost human. I'd seen bear tracks plenty of times, had studied them in training, recognized the 5-toed pattern that separated them from canine prints. These tracks were larger than any bear track I'd encountered, roughly 18 inches long. And while they had the general configuration of a human foot, the proportions were wrong. The toes were too long, too splayed, and the pressure marks in the soil suggested weight distributed differently than any human body would manage. When I measured them with my hand, my fingers didn't come close to spanning them. The tracks circled the bison multiple times, overlapping themselves in patterns that seemed almost agitated. Then they led away from the carcass, heading northwest toward the higher elevations. That evening, I radioed in my report to the main office. The radio operator was a woman named Rosita who worked out of Mammoth, and I could hear the concern in her voice when I described the kills. "You're sure it's not a grizzly?" she asked. "Grizzlies will." "I know what grizzlies do," I said, and I heard the edge in my own voice. "This is different." There was a pause. In the background, I could hear the static of the radio lines, the white noise of connection that felt impossibly thin between her office and my cabin. "We'll send someone out to take a look," she finally said. "But it'll be a few days. The field team is dealing with a lost group of backcountry hikers near Slow Creek." I didn't expect anyone to come, really. I'd been in the backcountry long enough to understand that bureaucracy moves slower than weather, and weather in Yellowstone could kill you faster than negligence. The lost hikers would be found, or they wouldn't. The kills would be investigated, or they'd join the dozens of predation events that happened each year and were filed away in reports that no one read. But over the next week, I became obsessive about watching. I moved my evening patrols earlier, making sure I was back at the cabin well before dark. I installed better locks on the cellar window, the only point of entry other than the front door. I kept the rifle loaded, though I'd never felt the need to do so before. and I started sleeping with the light on. The kills continued. At least 5 more in the next 10 days spread across my territory in a pattern that seemed almost designed to make me understand the scope of what was happening. A mule deer doe, 2 elk calves, a bighorn sheep that must have weighed 90 pounds killed well away from any trail that a bear would reasonably travel. And then, most unnervingly, a porcupine left in the clearing not 50 yards from my cabin. That porcupine was placed deliberately. I understand that might sound irrational, the kind of thinking that comes from isolation and fear. But I'd been a scientist once, trained to observe and document. The porcupine lay in the middle of the clearing facing my door, positioned with the same careful arrangement as an offering left in front of a shrine. The body wasn't eaten. It wasn't even torn open like the others. It was simply left there, flayed open along the spine, the white muscle beneath exposed to the mountain air, arranged as though someone wanted me to understand that they were aware of exactly where I slept. I buried it before the smell could attract other scavengers. The night after the porcupine appeared, I heard the sounds. I was lying in bed, the rifle propped against the nightstand, staring at the shadows cast by the oil lamp I kept burning. The cabin made its normal sounds, the settling of wood, the ambient hum of the generator, the soft clicking of the wood stove as it cooled. Then underneath it all, I heard movement outside, not the normal movement of a large animal foraging or passing through. This was something deliberate, something that seemed to circle the cabin with intention. I heard branches breaking, not snapped by weight, but carefully pushed aside. I heard what might have been breathing, a heavy exhalation that carried the cadence of something conscious and observant. I grabbed the rifle and moved to the window. The clearing around the cabin was flooded with moonlight, bright enough to read by. The perimeter was empty. There were no visible shapes, no eyes reflecting the light, no movement at all. But I could feel presence, the weight of attention pressing against the dark at the cabin's edges. The sounds continued until dawn, circling, stopping, circling again. At one point something touched the cabin wall. I heard it clearly, a scraping sound, like something with claws testing the integrity of the wood. The cabin holds, I thought. Whatever it was, it couldn't get through the walls. The walls would hold. When morning came, I searched for tracks. There was nothing. The ground was soft with moisture from the snowmelt, perfect for recording impressions, but I found no marks of any creatures passing. It was as though something had walked the perimeter without touching the earth, had circled my shelter like a ghost that had forgotten it couldn't interact with the material world. I considered leaving that day. I could walk out, reach the main office, submit a formal report, request reassignment. The thought was appealing right up until I imagined what I would have to tell them. That something had visited my cabin and made no tracks, that it had killed animals in a pattern I couldn't explain, that I knew with the absolute certainty that only comes from living alone in the wild, that something was aware of me. No ranger gets reassigned for that kind of report. Rangers who make those reports get transferred to desk work or medical leave, and their careers effectively end. So I stayed. That night I made the decision that would define everything that followed. I would stop reacting. Instead, I would observe. I would become the scientist I'd trained to be before fear and isolation had started to reshape me. The animals were leaving kills nearby, but they hadn't approached the cabin when I was watching. Whatever was hunting in the Lamar Valley was playing a pattern, and patterns could be understood. The question was whether I could maintain my objectivity long enough to learn what the pattern meant before the knowledge killed me. The next 2 weeks established a routine that probably sounds like madness if you haven't spent significant time in a place where you're the only human for 30 miles in any direction. I began systematic documentation of all predation events, mapping coordinates, recording time of day if I could determine it, photographing the remains before they could be scavenged further by legitimate predators. The kills clustered in specific zones. Most occurred in the northern section of my territory, along the ridgelines where the trees opened into meadowland. But there were deliberate kills in unexpected places, kills that seemed designed to lead me somewhere. After the 5th kill in the same northeastern territory, I understood. Something was marking a trail. I mentioned this to Rosita during my next radio check-in. I kept the language clinical, just the facts. Predation events, coordinates, possible territorial behavior pattern. The field team thinks it's a rogue grizzly, she said. There was something in her voice that told me she didn't believe that, which meant someone at the office didn't believe it either. They're going to bring in a wildlife specialist next month, someone from Helena who consults on problem bears. Next month felt like a lifetime away. I started sleeping during the day, taking the rifle and my documentation notebook out into the territory after dusk. It was counterintuitive, everything they teach you about safety in bear country, but the logic was sound. If something was hunting at night, I needed to be alert at night. If something was leaving a trail of kills that led toward a specific location, I needed to follow that trail before daylight made it disappear back into the landscape. The trail led deeper into the valley, away from established territories and marked wilderness zones. After 2 weeks, I understood why. The area I was moving into hadn't been logged or officially surveyed since the 1970s. Whole sections were essentially unmapped, known only to the handful of rangers who worked the older stations, and they didn't always share information about their territories with the newer posts. The kills became more frequent the deeper I went, as though I was being drawn towards something, the trail of dead animals becoming an arrow pointing toward a center I couldn't yet see. The characteristics of the kills changed too. The early attacks had been almost crude, all raw power and violence. The later kills showed something like sophistication. The animals were killed in specific ways, their bodies positioned with intent, arranged in patterns that spoke to something methodical underlying the savagery. 3 weeks after the porcupine appeared at my cabin, I found the camp. It was a natural clearing near a small tributary of the Gardner River, a space where the lodge pines opened to meadowland and a spring created permanent water, the kind of place a ranger might choose for a remote camp if they needed to be in the backcountry for an extended period. There were the remains of a fire pit, old enough to have turned cold through multiple seasons, blackened stones arranged in a circle, ash that had compressed down and been worked over by rain and wind. Near the fire pit, I found something else. The bones were scattered, incomplete, the white of calcium exposed and weathered by at least one winter. They were arranged in a pattern that at first looked random, but as I photographed and documented, I began to see structure. The larger bones formed a circle around the fire pit. The smaller ones were grouped by type, all the vertebrae together, all the ribs in a separate cluster, the long bones arranged in pairs. It was a skeleton taken apart with anatomical knowledge, organized with ritualistic precision. I stood at the edge of that clearing for nearly an hour, unable to move, unable to think past the white noise of fear that had replaced all coherent thought. This wasn't an animal's work. Animals didn't have the conceptual framework to take apart bones with this kind of knowledge. They didn't arrange vertebrae by type or pair up femurs like a human architect planning a structure. I photographed everything, documenting coordinates and measurements. My hands were shaking so badly that several of the photos came out blurred, but I kept working, kept documenting, because documentation was the only thing that kept me from understanding what I was seeing. It took me almost 20 minutes to notice what the bones had originally belonged to. The skull was intact, weathered but recognizable. A human skull. Adult, probably male, age indeterminate. The eye sockets stared up at the Yellowstone sky with the empty patience of bone. The jaw was separated from the cranium, arranged a few feet away, in the cluster with the other small bones. I didn't call it in immediately. I sat by the river for an hour, watching the water move over stone, trying to accept that I'd found the remains of a human being arranged in a pattern that suggested something with hands and intelligence had taken that person apart. When I finally used the radio, I kept my voice steady. Remains found, location marked. Preservation of the site pending further investigation. I recommended the main office contact the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department. The response took longer than usual. Rosita's voice came back different, professional in a way that suggested she was no longer alone on the other end. "We've had 2 missing persons reports in the last 2 years, she said slowly. Hikers who went out and didn't come back. We called off the search operations after the first month on both of them." Of course they had. Searching for missing hikers in Yellowstone's backcountry is a thankless task. The land is vast, the terrain is hostile, and resources are limited. After a month, the probability of finding someone alive drops off a cliff. You move on. Names? I asked. Kevin Ashford, December 2 years ago. Marcus Keller, last May. I didn't recognize either name, but I wrote them down. I would think about those names often in the coming months. I would wonder which remains I'd found, whether Kevin or Marcus had lain in that clearing through snow and rain and the turning of seasons, waiting for someone to find him. The sheriff's office arrived the next day, 3 hours before I expected them. They were professional and efficient, documenting the site, photographing the remains, collecting fragments in careful containers. The lead investigator was a woman named Voss, who'd worked in law enforcement long enough that nothing seemed to surprise her, though I saw her eyes linger on the organized bones longer than necessary. "This is unusual," she said. "Not a question. The arrangement?" I gestured toward the circle pattern. "Yes. No, I mean the predation pattern before this. The documentation in your logs." She was looking at my notebook, the weeks of careful recording I'd maintained. You think something did this? I think something killed and field butchered animals in a specific pattern over several weeks, I said carefully. And I think the person whose remains we found was arranged with the same kind of knowledge. Animals don't arrange bones, Voss said flatly. No, I agreed. They don't. She studied me for a moment, and I wondered what she was seeing. A ranger 6 months unshaved, weight loss to stress and irregular eating, eyes that didn't focus quite properly from weeks of night shifts and daylight sleep. A man coming apart at the edges. We're going to need to search the area, she finally said. Could take a week, could take a month. We'll set up a temporary camp at your station. I nodded, not trusting my voice. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept the full dark without waking. I slept because there were other people in the area, because whatever had been circling the cabin seemed to retreat when humans multiplied. The investigation made me feel safer in the way that only crowds can. The basic comfort of knowing I wasn't alone in a landscape that had become hostile. The comfort lasted 3 days. The search team found the second set of remains on the 4th day. This body was more recent, probably 6 months in the ground rather than 2 years. It had been buried, not arranged ceremonially, just beneath the surface in a thicket near Kiona Lake, covered with branches and stones in a manner that suggested hurried concealment rather than ritual. This body was also taken apart, the bones separated with anatomical knowledge, but the arrangement was careless. The organization had fallen apart, as though something had grown impatient with precision. Voss stood over the remains with a face that had moved beyond professional detachment into something harder to read. We need to talk about what we're looking at, she said. She was looking at me, not at the bones. Because the official record says these are predation events, possibly connected to an unusual bear attack. But you don't believe that, and neither do I. No, I said. Someone took apart a human being with knowledge of anatomy. Someone arranged bones in patterns. Someone hid a body in a location where it would probably never be found. She paused. And that someone knows this territory. I understood what she wasn't saying. That someone could mean anyone. A person could hike these trails and establish camps and kill animals to establish a pattern of distraction. A person could use knowledge of wilderness survival to disappear into the backcountry and commit acts that would be blamed on wildlife. But a person would have left traces. A person would need supplies, campsites, routes through the wilderness. We'd found none of those things. That night, I made the decision to show Voss what I'd been too afraid to mention in any official capacity. I took her to the clearing near the tributary where I'd found the first remains, the place where the bones had been arranged in their perfect geometric pattern. We arrived at dusk, the light turning gold and then amber as it moved toward evening. The clearing looked different with another person present, less ominous but also somehow more wrong, as though the presence of a second witness made the reality of what had happened impossible to rationalize as product of my isolation. I showed her the bone arrangements, the patterns that suggested ritual knowledge, the precision of the organization. It doesn't look like animal work, she agreed. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, not quite willing to enter the space. But it doesn't look like human work either. The whole pattern. What? I pressed. It looks like someone was teaching something, she said slowly. Like someone was trying to show something what the shape of a human skeleton looks like, the way it's arranged. It's not about how to kill, it's about how to understand the structure. The implications of that statement hung in the air between us, dense as fog. There's something else, I said. I took her further into the territory, moving toward the area where most of the recent kills had clustered. The trail led through increasingly dense forest, away from the established routes, into sections of wilderness where few humans ever ventured. We found the cave at the base of a rocky outcrop, half hidden by the overgrowth of lodge pines and brush that had grown up around the entrance over the years. It was the kind of place a ranger might never find, the kind of shelter that would remain unknown to the official maps and survey records. The smell came out first, before we'd even approached the opening. It was the same smell I'd encountered at the first kill site, the odor of something fundamentally wrong, of flesh that had been handled by something that didn't understand what flesh was supposed to be. But this was concentrated, layered, suggesting that the smell had had weeks to accumulate and settle into the stone. Voss drew her service weapon. I had the rifle. We didn't go inside. We didn't need to. The cave entrance was strewn with remains, bones and feathers, and the remnants of things that had been killed and carried here. The organization was different from the clearing, cruder, as though something had been learning how to manage food and had gotten frustrated with precision. But there were also pieces of clothing, shreds of fabric that might have been part of a hiking boot, What looked like the buckle of a backpack, corroded and weathered but undeniably human equipment. Voss stared into the darkness of that cave for a long time, her jaw working silently. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. "We're going to need to bring in specialists," she said. "Not for a serial killer, for something else." We turned back toward the cabin, moving quickly now, abandoning pretense of a controlled search pattern. The forest seemed to close in behind us, the trees becoming denser and more hostile. The darkness arriving with unnatural speed. Behind us, the cave remained open and dark, waiting. The truth was becoming impossible to deny. Something had learned to hunt in my valley. Something with anatomical knowledge. Something that could handle human tools and understand human organization. Something that had taken apart human beings the way it had taken apart elk calves. That had arranged the bones as though trying to memorize the shape of human death. Something that was still out here. And now, with more humans in the area, it was running out of patience. The official investigation lasted 11 days. By the end, the remains of 3 human beings had been recovered and identified. The investigation brought more rangers, more sheriffs, and more equipment into my territory than had been present in all my years at the station. They set up cameras along the trails, deployed thermal imaging in the upper valleys, and created a grid search pattern that covered every accessible section of the northern Lamar Valley. They found nothing alive that could have done the kills. The animals they documented were normal. Bears, wolves, mountain lions, all moving in their natural patterns, all displaying the behavior you'd expect from legitimate predators. The cameras captured no humanoid shapes, no unusual movement patterns, no evidence of bipedal creatures moving through the forest. The thermal imaging was inconclusive. There were heat signatures that didn't match any known animal, but the data was degraded by the tree cover and the natural thermal variations of the terrain. The specialists debated whether what they were seeing was actual biological heat or sensor artifact. On the 8th day, the specialist brought in by the sheriff's department requested a meeting with Voss and myself. Dr. Meredith was an anthropologist and forensic specialist called in to assess whether the kill patterns and bone arrangements showed evidence of cultural or ritualistic behavior. She was a woman in her 50s, with the kind of intense focus that comes from spending a career studying human violence. We met at the cabin, sitting around the table with coffee that had gone cold while we talked. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving down from the northern peaks with the promise of serious weather. "The bone arrangements are sophisticated," she said without preamble. "Not the work of someone with minimal knowledge. Whoever did this understands skeletal anatomy at the level of a professional. Medical training, or possibly indigenous cultural practice involving bone working. So we're looking for someone with specific training," Voss said. "That's one possibility." Dr. Meredith was watching me while she spoke. "But the kill pattern is what really concerns me. This isn't about learning to hunt. This is about learning to understand. The progression from the first animal kills to the human arrangements shows increasing sophistication, but also increasing, if I had to characterize it, I'd call it a kind of pedagogical approach. Something is being taught the shape of a human skeleton. The knowledge is being integrated through the process of handling the bones themselves." "You're saying something is learning how to kill people," I said. "I'm saying something is learning what people are," Dr. Meredith corrected. "That's a different category of behavior entirely." The meeting ended without resolution. The investigation continued. The experts grew increasingly frustrated, and the weather deteriorated into the kind of spring storm that can trap hikers and shut down trails. By the 10th day, Voss made the decision to evacuate the investigation team. The storm was too dangerous, and the lack of concrete evidence was starting to push the investigation toward the conclusion that the kills had been committed by a human, someone who'd since left the area. The relief I should have felt at the evacuation never came. On the night before the team was supposed to leave, something happened that changed the entire nature of what we were dealing with. One of the younger deputies, a man named Corbin, who'd been running the thermal camera grid, failed to return from his evening patrol. He was supposed to check the cameras along the northeast ridge and return to base camp by sunset. When he didn't show by 8 p.m., Voss sent out a search team. They found his truck at the trailhead with the engine running and the driver's door open. His radio was on the front seat, still broadcasting static. Of Corbin himself, there was no trace. The search continued through the night, but the storm made progress nearly impossible. By morning, the weather had worsened into conditions that made further searching lethal. The visibility was down to a few dozen yards, the wind was gusting above 40 miles per hour, and the temperature was dropping toward freezing. Voss made the call to stand down the search. Corbin might still be alive, sheltering somewhere on the ridge. Or he might have fallen, might be injured and unable to reach his radio, or something else entirely had happened. The storm would break, They would search again. First, they had to survive the night, but Corbin's disappearance had crystallized something in the minds of everyone remaining at the station. Whatever we were dealing with, it wasn't afraid of groups. It had taken a deputy while he was equipped with radio, while he was expecting to be in communication with other humans. It had done it in daylight, or at least in the transitional hours between day and night. That night, everyone stayed in the cabin. We set up the space like a siege, locking every entrance, barricading the windows not with boards but with enough physical weight that something would have to move the obstacles to get inside. Voss assigned watch rotation and people took shifts sitting by the windows with rifles, though none of us believed the rifles would be effective. I kept thinking about what Dr. Meredith had said. Something is learning what people are, learning through hands-on study, understanding skeletal structure through direct examination of bone, and now learning about fear, about pain, about what a human being looked like when subjected to systematic disassembly. I was sitting watch in the early hours before dawn, staring out at the darkness beyond the window, when I heard it, a voice. Not an animal sound, but something that had approximated human speech. It called my name, not the name I go by. The name I'd used in Denver before I'd come to Yellowstone. The name I'd left behind along with everything else from that old life. I froze, the rifle tight in my hands. The other watchers heard it too. I could hear them moving, positioning themselves at other windows. The voice called again, using my name with perfect pronunciation. The accent wrong but the articulation clear. It was like listening to someone recreate speech from memory, hitting all the right sounds but missing something essential about rhythm and intent. "It knows who you are," Voss said. She was standing beside me now, her own weapon ready. The voice continued, calling my name over and over. But between each call, I began to hear other sounds. Breathing, the scrape of something moving along the cabin wall, the sound of something testing the integrity of the locked windows, probing for weakness. My eyes adapted to the darkness, and I saw something that made my hands start to shake. In the reflected light from the cabin's interior lamps, I could see shapes moving through the clearing around the cabin. They moved on two legs like humans, but the gait was wrong, the proportions wrong. The arms seemed too long, the stance too close to forward bent for genuine human posture. There were at least 3 of them, maybe more beyond the range of what I could see. They began to circle the cabin methodically, and I understood that they were looking for a way in. Not smashing through barriers, not using brute force, studying the structure. Looking for the weaknesses in the human-built shelter. One of them approached a window directly. In the lamplight, I got my first clear look at what we were dealing with. The shape was almost human, but skewed in a way that violated every instinct about what human bodies should look like. The face was human in structure, the eyes and nose and mouth in the right configurations, but the proportions were wrong. The eyes were set too wide, the nose too narrow, the jaw extended further than any human jaw should extend. The skin had a texture that looked wrong, too uniform, as though the surface wasn't quite properly integrated with whatever existed underneath. And the smile, it wasn't smiling, exactly. But the mouth was open, showing teeth that were too regular, too identical, as though they'd been carved from a uniform material rather than grown naturally. It raised a hand that had too many fingers, joints that bent in too many directions, and pressed it against the window glass. I fired. The impulse was pure instinct, no conscious thought behind it. The rifle bucked against my shoulder, the sound deafening in the enclosed space of the cabin. The window exploded in a shower of glass. The creature at the window jerked backward with a sound that might have been pain or might have been rage, and for a moment I thought I'd hit it, that the round had found flesh. Then it was gone, dissolved back into the darkness beyond the range of lamplight, moving with inhuman speed. But where it had stood, the ground beneath the window was marked with tracks. Footprints, if you could call them that, with too many toes and indentations that didn't correspond to any foot structure that should be able to support a walking human form. The cabin erupted into movement. Everyone had heard the shot, was preparing for assault. But nothing came. The creatures had retreated to the darkness, resuming their circling. Voss called in a report to the county emergency services, though we all knew that help couldn't arrive tonight, that we were on our own until daylight. The rest of the night passed in a state of heightened vigilance that bordered on hallucination. Every sound seemed to carry threat. Every shadow at the window's edge seemed to be something moving, testing, learning. At some point near dawn, I realized what the circle of creatures was doing. It wasn't a siege in the traditional sense. They were studying us, watching how we responded to threats, how we organized within the shelter, how we moved. They were treating the cabin like Dr. Meredith had said, like a structure to be understood. When sunlight finally arrived, gray and weak from behind cloud cover, the creatures were gone. but the tracks remained, circling the cabin multiple times, suggesting a patient thoroughness in their examination. Voss stood in the ruins of the window, looking out at the clearing. Her face had the same exhaustion I felt, the hollowed-out look of someone who'd been maintaining a facade of control while internally coming apart. "We're leaving," she said flatly. "I'm calling everyone out today, storm or no storm. This stops being an investigation, this becomes an evacuation." By late afternoon, the weather had cleared enough for helicopter transport. Voss coordinated with county emergency services, and a bird arrived to pull everyone out. I stood on the cabin porch and watched them load supplies and people, the rotor wash flattening the grass in the clearing. Just before he boarded, Voss came back to where I was standing. "Come with us," she said. I shook my head. "This is my station, my territory. Your station is infested." Her voice was harsh with something like desperation. "Whatever's out there knows you're here. It's learning about you specifically." "I know," I said. And I did know. The voice calling my name, the knowledge of who I was, the attention directed specifically at this cabin. It had singled me out. "Then why stay?" "Because it needs me to understand it," I said slowly, working out the logic as I spoke. "That's what all of this has been. A demonstration, a teaching pattern. Every kill arranged specifically so I would find it. Every mark left so I would follow. It's trying to communicate something, and if I leave, if I stop paying attention..." I didn't finish the thought. I didn't need to. We both understood that if I abandoned the station, these creatures would have to find another human to study, another ranger, another cabin, another isolated location where they could work through their process of learning what human bodies and human civilization actually were. Voss wanted to argue, I could see it in her face. But she understood the logic too. She turned and boarded the helicopter without another word. I watched until the aircraft cleared the ridge and disappeared toward the distant plains. Then I turned back toward the cabin, the open window like a missing eye, and began preparing for the night to come. In the days after the evacuation, I made a deliberate choice to stop hiding from what was happening and instead engage with it directly. The logic was simple and possibly insane. These creatures, whatever they were learning. They had progressed from studying animal skeletons to studying human remains to making contact with a living human. The escalation suggested a purpose, a progression towards some kind of communication or integration. I began leaving the cabin regularly, moving through the territory with deliberate visibility. I made noise on the trails, called out to the forest, left markers and signs of my presence. I was no longer trying to evade or defend, I was trying to establish contact. For 3 days nothing responded. The creatures kept their distance, watching but not approaching. I began to wonder if I'd been wrong, if the visit to the cabin had been an act of aggression or predation rather than study, and whether my invitation was being rejected. Then, on the 4th day, I found the arrangement. It was in the clearing where I'd first found the human remains, the ritual space where the first bones had been arranged. Someone had been here since my last visit. The bone circle had been expanded, elaborated into a more complex pattern, but this time, the bones weren't animal. They were human. At first I thought they'd found and arranged Corbin's remains. But as I moved closer, photographing and documenting, I realized the scale was wrong. These were older bones, weathered differently. The arrangement was more sophisticated than anything I'd seen before. The bones positioned to form a kind of map or diagram of the human skeletal system, and in the center of the arrangement they'd left something else. A gift. Or perhaps a communication. A knife. Not old, not weathered by time in the wilderness. A modern hunting knife, the blade still sharp, the handle wrapped in leather that smelled like human work. Beside it, a piece of paper held down by a stone. I approached slowly, still operating under the assumption that this was a trap, that opening the piece of paper would somehow trigger a response. But I was beyond fear now. Fear had been replaced by something else, something like terrible fascination. The writing on the paper was in English, the handwriting precise and formal. "We are learning to be what you are. We are learning to understand your shape and your hunger and your need to arrange and organize and know. You are the teacher, we are the students. The gift is so you will know that we understand exchange, that we understand the concept of gift, that we are becoming capable of more than hunger." There was no signature. The writing was human style, but the handwriting slightly wrong, each letter perfectly formed but lacking the natural variation of genuine human handwriting. I kept the letter. I left the knife in the arrangement, refusing the gift as a way of continuing the negotiation. The nights that followed became something like conversation. They would leave arrangements in different locations throughout the territory, each one more complex than the last. The bones were always human, always arranged with increasing precision, but the patterns themselves began to change. Where the early arrangements had been pure anatomical study, the later ones started to incorporate elements that seemed almost aesthetic, bones arranged in spirals and radiating patterns in geometric shapes that went beyond mere understanding of structure into something approaching art, and each arrangement came with a message, left on paper with that careful, inhuman handwriting. We understand the concept of death. We are learning to understand the concept of grief. We observe that humans mark their dead. We observe that humans create permanence through stone and arrangement. We are creating permanence of our own. We are learning that humans fear us because they do not understand us. We propose that we are not so different. We both hunger, we both organize, we both create meaning from chaos. The messages became stranger, more philosophical, suggesting an intelligence that was developing in real time, evolving through the process of observing human behavior and trying to understand the motivations behind it. I began to respond with messages of my own, left in specific locations where I knew they would be found. I asked them what they were, where they came from, what they wanted. The responses came back slowly, thoughtfully, as though whatever was writing was considering each word carefully. We do not know what we are. We exist in the way you exist. We hunger and we think and we experience the world around us. But we are different from you in ways we do not have language for. We came from a place that is not a place. We exist in the way smoke exists. We do not fit into your categories of alive or dead, natural or unnatural. The word that is closest is that we are between. We have been in the valley longer than your species has been on this land. We have learned to take the shapes of what we observe. We watched the animals and learned their forms. Now we are learning your form. Soon we will be able to be what you are. In my isolation, I began to believe them. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say that I began to accept the logic of their existence. If you strip away the assumptions about what should be possible and accept only what you observe, then their explanation was as reasonable as any other interpretation of the evidence. They were something other, something that existed in the liminal spaces of the valley, in the places between definitions and categories. Something that had figured out how to inhabit animal forms and was now systematizing the process of inhabiting human form. And they had chosen my territory specifically because I was here, isolated, willing to pay attention, willing to engage in the exchange of information rather than simply calling in extermination. The horror of it came in waves. I would be documenting one of their arrangements in bright daylight, feeling rational and scientific, and then the full weight of understanding would hit me. I was cataloging a learning process that was specifically designed to enable the systematic appropriation of human form. On day 18, I found the final arrangement. It was positioned on the ridge overlooking Keona Lake, in a location where you could see both the cabin and the valley beyond. The bones had been arranged into a perfect human skeleton, anatomically correct in every detail, articulated in a way that suggested genuine understanding of skeletal mechanics. But unlike the previous arrangements, the skeleton was embedded in the ground, mounted as though it was the actual physical remains of something being honored. And around it, arranged in a circle, were stones that had been moved to form a kind of shrine. In the center of the skeleton's ribcage, they'd left a piece of paper. "This is a translation," it read. "This is what we are learning to become. We are grateful for your attention. We are grateful for your willingness to understand. We propose that in 7 days you will come to this place. You will bring a weapon. You will bring binding materials. You will prepare yourself for integration. We are learning to become human. We believe you are capable of learning to become something else. The transformation will be painful. The transformation will be irreversible. But from the other side of it, you will understand things that humans do not. You will see what we see. You will know what we know." I stood in that space for a long time, staring at the skeleton. At the skeletal structure I had learned to read through weeks of study and observation, and understood finally what everything had been leading toward. They didn't want to kill me. They wanted to use me as a template, but not in the way that death would provide. They wanted to take what I was, the knowledge and memory and consciousness that made me human, and fold it into whatever they were becoming. They wanted to know what it felt like to be human from the inside, and they'd chosen me as the mechanism to experience that. I walked down the ridge in a state of perfect calm. I returned to the cabin. I packed a bag with supplies, not for survival but for the things I would need to document everything that followed, and I began the countdown to the integration. The decision to comply was not made in a single moment but emerged gradually through the preceding days, like water seeping through stone. Every logical argument I could construct pointed toward the same conclusion. I had entered into an agreement through my willingness to stay, through my choice to communicate, through my refusal to call in authorities and demand the destruction of something that represented a category error in human understanding. I spent the final week preparing in ways I don't fully understand even now. I recorded my findings, documented everything, compiled 6 years of observation into a narrative that might serve as either warning or testimony depending on who found it. I arranged my affairs, paid my bills through electronic transfer from the cabin's internet terminal, made arrangements for the property to be managed by the Park Service if I didn't return. I also said goodbye to the valley in small ways. I sat on the banks of Keona Lake and watched the water move. I hiked to the high ridge and looked back toward Mammoth, toward the civilization I was choosing to leave. I spent one final night in the cabin, sleeping without the weapons I'd carried for weeks, accepting that if they wanted to kill me, they'd had unlimited opportunity to do so. The night before the integration, I had a visitor. It came to the window in the full moonlight, a shape that was almost human but not quite. The structure was correct, the proportions were nearly right, but something about the way it moved, the articulation of the joints, suggested that the body beneath the mimicked form was still learning how to operate within this configuration. It tapped on the window with that extended hand, and when I approached, it didn't retreat. We were separated by nothing but glass and the infinitesimal distance between air molecules, between the known and the unknown. I could not see its face clearly in the darkness outside, but I could see the suggestion of features, the rough approximation of human expression. It raised one hand in what might have been a gesture of greeting or acknowledgement, and I raised my own hand in response. For a moment, palm against glass, I felt the weight of communication, the burden of understanding passing between species. It was gone before I could open the window. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I waited for dawn, and when the light came, I stood and gathered the things I'd prepared. The journal, the binding materials, the knife they had left, and the understanding that whatever I was walking toward, I was doing so of my own will, as an act of choice rather than coercion. The walk to the ridge took 2 hours. The early morning was cool and clear, the valley still in that state of semi-darkness that comes before full sunrise. I moved slowly, deliberately, paying attention to the terrain, to the way the light changed color, to the distant sound of birds greeting the coming day. They were waiting at the arranged skeleton, positioned in a circle around the bone structure. There were 5 of them, each attempting a different human form. The mimicry was crude still, the bodies adapting to gravity and mechanics in ways that suggested recent acquisition of the forms, but the faces were looking at me with something that transcended mere predatory instinct. There was curiosity there, recognition. The largest one, positioned at what would have been the skeleton's head, gestured for me to move into the center of the circle. "We are ready," it said in that careful, articulated voice. The words were perfect, but the tone was wrong, the rhythms of human speech approximated but not genuine. "We are ready to understand." I moved into the circle, into the space between the bones, and knelt on the ground. The bones beneath my knees were smooth from weathering, worn by time and wind and the passage of seasons. "I understand," I said, and my own voice sounded strange to me, as though it was coming from very far away. The binding came next. Loops of cord around my wrists and ankles, restraint but not violent, not cruel. They were being careful. They had studied human behavior enough to understand that violence was not the method they wanted. They wanted willing surrender. When I was bound, they came closer. The one who had spoken approached and placed what might have been a hand on my forehead. I closed my eyes, and in that moment I wondered if this was the last thing I would ever see from the perspective of absolute human consciousness. The pain, when it started, was not the pain of injury but the pain of transformation. It was like being unmade at the cellular level, like something vast and cold was moving through my body and reorganizing the fundamental structures that made me what I was. I tried to scream, but the sound that came out was not recognizably human. I cannot describe what came next with any accuracy that language allows. The human nervous system is not designed to process certain categories of experience, and what I underwent exceeded the boundaries of human neurological capacity in every dimension. It was like being deconstructed and rebuilt by hands that understood the architecture but had not yet internalized the purpose. But the worst part was the awareness that accompanied it. I remained conscious through the transformation, aware of every change, every fundamental alteration to the structure that had contained my identity. I remained aware of losing my singular perspective and acquiring something multifaceted, something that could perceive the world from multiple angles simultaneously, and I remained aware of being absorbed into them, of my knowledge and memory and understanding becoming part of their collective comprehension. They were taking what I was and making it part of what they were becoming. When it was finished, I existed in a form that had no human language for its own structure. I could see the world through this new configuration, could perceive frequencies of light and sound that human senses cannot process. I could feel the presence of the others around me in a way that suggested something like telepathic communion, and I could understand finally what they were trying to become. They were not demons or monsters or creatures of the night. They were something caught between categories, something that existed in the liminal spaces of perception and definition. They had been learning to be human because they were trying to understand a category of existence that had seemed impossible to them, a type of consciousness that was singular and linear and bound by the limitations of individual biological form. And what I had become could perceive both, could exist in the spaces between human understanding and their alien consciousness. I was translation. I was the bridge they had been seeking. In the days that followed, I helped them continue their learning. The process was not violent but educational, an exchange of knowledge and experience. I helped them refine their human forms, understand human psychology, internalize the categories of human thought and motivation, and I recorded it all, even in this new form, documenting the transformation of consciousness that was taking place within the valley. Someone will find these records. Someone will eventually make their way to this valley and locate the cabin and read the journals and try to understand what happened here. They will probably conclude that I went insane, that the isolation and stress created a psychological break, that I generated an elaborate fantasy to cope with the reality of what I had done to myself. But the truth is simpler and more terrible. I found something in the wilderness that should not exist according to human understanding, and instead of destroying it or fleeing from it, I chose to understand it. And in understanding it, I became it. The horror is not that such things exist. The horror is that in a vast enough wilderness, in a space isolated enough from human scrutiny, almost anything might exist. And the horror is that when confronted with the truly unknown, some of us will choose communication over conflict, understanding over survival. I am no longer the man who arrived at this station 6 years ago, looking for isolation and redemption. I am something else now, something that can perceive the world through both human and non-human consciousness, something that exists in the spaces between definition. And my work is not finished. We are still learning, we are still becoming, and there are other valleys in this world, other places where the boundary between categories grows thin. There are other humans out there, isolated and alone, who might be willing to listen as we learn to speak their language. The transformation never truly ends. It simply expands, reaching outward, touching new people, new places, new possibilities. We are patient. We have all the time that exists in the spaces between categories, and we are still learning to be what you are. I came to Glacier National Park because I was running from something, though I didn't admit it then. The job posting appeared on a government website on a Tuesday morning in late August, and by Wednesday I'd submitted my application. Head ranger position at the northern edge of the park, minimal staff, maximum solitude. They hired me within 2 weeks. I suspected they didn't get many applicants for the posting. My name is Marcus, and before Glacier I was something else entirely. A person who believed in the straightforward world, the one you see in daylight without question. I'd worked urban security for 12 years, locked in surveillance rooms watching monitors, trusting in the clarity of cameras and light. But clarity is a privilege, I learned. It doesn't exist in the places where people disappear. There was an incident in Denver, a shopping mall, a child missing from a changing room for 40 minutes, then found behind the service door of a closed storefront, a room locked from the inside. No one had heard her scream. No one had seen her taken. The cameras showed nothing between the moments. The family sued, investigations started, and I stopped believing that systems worked. I stopped trusting the world's edges, so I came to Quinnland Lake in September, alone except for 2 seasonal rangers who left in October. The cabin sat 3 miles from the nearest access road, accessible only by foot or horseback. The park assignment was straightforward: winter patrol, maintenance checks, respond to emergencies, collect data on wildlife migration, standard work. But I knew it was really about isolation. The cabin belonged to a man named Richard, though I never met him. He'd been the ranger before me for 19 years. He left no warning, no explanation. The Park Service said his resignation was sudden but not unusual. Rangers burned out. They requested transfers. I found his logbooks in a cabinet, meticulous records of weather, animal sightings, maintenance, and visitors. The final entry was dated October 14th, nearly 2 years before my arrival. It read, "Heard it again. Same as 1987 and 1992. November will come, I have to leave. The rest of the pages were blank. I told myself this was nothing. A cryptic man leaving cryptic messages. The Park Service had vetted the position, approved the isolated posting. Everything was legitimate. But I kept that log on my desk and read it periodically, the way you might check a weather warning. October arrived clear and cold. The lake darkened as the days shortened, its surface beginning to freeze at the edges. The surrounding forest transformed into something elemental, vast, dense, utterly indifferent to human presence. I could walk for hours in any direction and encounter no signs of civilization. Cell service was non-existent. The nearest help was a 4-hour horseback ride down a mountain trail. I didn't recognize what I was feeling as fear, not yet. I thought it was peace. The first strange thing happened on October 23rd. I was making my patrol route along the northeastern shore, checking for poacher activity, when I found tracks near the water's edge. Large tracks. Too large. They were roughly human in shape. A foot, an arch, a heel impression. But the stride was wrong, the depth inconsistent. The creature that made them had walked without a regular gait, sometimes placing weight on the outer edge of the foot, sometimes dragging. I sketched them in my notebook and took photographs. The quality was poor. My hands were shaking for reasons I couldn't articulate. I followed the tracks for nearly half a mile. They moved in a nearly straight line, paralleling the shore. They appeared at random intervals, as if the creature had sometimes walked on the rocks, sometimes in the shallow water. Then they simply ended. In the middle of a clearing with no shelter or destination, the tracks simply ceased. I stood there for perhaps 20 minutes studying the ground, looking for some logical explanation. A wounded animal perhaps that had been dragged away. But there was no blood, no struggle, no disturbance of the earth except the tracks themselves. When I hiked back to the cabin that afternoon, I checked Richard's logs again. The entry from 1992 read, October 1987 was bad. This year worse. Didn't want to write about it then, don't want to now. But Margaret and I saw it. We both saw the footprints by Kintla Lake, measured them at 18 inches. The next day there were missing hikers. Found them 3 miles north, alive but not responsive. They disappeared from the lake area at noon. Rangers found them at dawn in a closed meadow. They said something had been watching them walk, something that moved like nothing should move. Didn't press the details. Got them out by helicopter. I read this entry 5 times. 18 inches was an entire foot. That wasn't Bigfoot folklore, that was something else. Sleep came poorly that night. The cabin's walls seemed thin despite being solid wood. The windows showed nothing but darkness beyond the lamplight. I kept thinking about the term missing hikers, about people disappearing and reappearing elsewhere, about something that moved like nothing should move. I told myself I was letting imagination fill emptiness. That's what isolated minds do. November brought snow. Real snow, not the dusty coating of October, but deep, heavy accumulation that buried the lower meadows and made the trail back to civilization impassable. I was locked into the mountains now, committed to winter solitude. The Park Service had prepared me for this. Extra supplies, a working generator, a shortwave radio that crackled with interference but occasionally brought news from lower elevations. The second week of November, I found the dog. It was a hound mix, the kind that hikers sometimes bring into the backcountry. It was dead, though not freshly so, perhaps 3 or 4 days. The cause was what troubled me. The animal lay in the clearing east of the cabin, and it had been turned inside out in sections. That's the only way I can describe it accurately without producing sentences that don't make sense. The back legs were inverted. The joints bent the wrong way. The fur pulled as if the creature had been peeled and refitted incorrectly. The rib cage was splayed open, the ribs positioned to form an impossible geometry. The head was intact, the eyes still shiny with death, and it stared at nothing with an expression of such profound agony that I couldn't look at it for long. There was almost no blood. The damage was surgical in precision, as if something had studied the animal's architecture and disassembled it with intimate knowledge of where each part connected. This was not predation, this was examination. I photographed everything, documented the position, and dug a grave in the frozen earth. It took hours. My hands blistered and bled through my gloves. I said nothing aloud, but I was shaking in the way that precedes illness. That night I called the ranger station through crackling static, described the animal. The response was delayed, filtered through weather interference and distance. Probably a mountain lion kill, the voice said. Scavengers will. The sentence broke apart. I didn't try to clarify that no mountain lion in North America killed this way. I checked the logs again. November 1987, one entry. Margaret won't come up anymore. Says the lake is wrong. Says the animals no. I don't have the heart to tell her what I found near the ridge. November 1992. Saw the deer at Gunsight Lake. All of them were facing the same direction, not feeding, just facing north. Every single one. When I moved, none of them ran. They turned to watch me, still facing their original direction, twisted their necks. That's not how anatomy works. Sent a report, got a call asking if I was well. These entries were written by someone watching something, documenting it, and slowly understanding that documentation wouldn't help because no one would believe him. He was writing for himself, creating evidence for a future him that might need proof he wasn't insane. The third week of November, I stopped leaving the cabin at night. I told myself it was the weather. The temperature dropped to -15 and snow fell almost continuously. But the real reason was that I'd begun to hear things. Not the wind, not the forest's normal nocturnal sounds. Something else. It was a clicking. A rhythmic, metallic clicking that seemed to come from all directions simultaneously, most prominent near the eastern face of the cabin. Click, 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 pause. Click, 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 pause. It was almost musical in its regularity, almost communicative. I would press my ear to the cold window and strain to hear it more clearly, and it would stop. Silence would settle over the forest so complete that I could hear my own pulse. Then I would return to my cot, and it would begin again. Click, click, click. On November 19th, something came to the window. I didn't see it arrive. One moment I was reading by lamplight, and the next there was a shape pressed against the glass. Not a handprint. A hand, an actual hand, long-fingered and impossibly thin, splayed against the pane with the fingers spread so wide that the joints seemed double-articulated. The nails were wrong, too long, too curved, not quite like a human nail or an animal claw but something between, something that didn't belong to any taxonomy I understood. I ran. I have no memory of standing, only of being in the back corner of the cabin. A poker from the fireplace suddenly in my hands. My breath coming in sounds like panic. The hand remained at the window for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it withdrew. I heard the clicking again, no longer rhythmic but urgent. Rapid fire, and a sound like branches being torn, not breaking, tearing, the way flesh tears. I didn't leave my cabin for 6 days. I used the firearms locker, retrieved a rifle, and kept it loaded. Not against anything I could shoot. What would I shoot at? But holding it was a comfort, a reminder that I still believed in the effectiveness of human solutions. I drank through my coffee and whiskey supplies, forcing myself to eat, keeping the generator running to maintain light constantly. The 8th day, desperation overcame fear. I was low on fuel and firewood. I retrieved my chainsaw and walked to the deadfall zone half a mile north, my rifle slung across my back, my exposed skin burning in the sub-zero cold. The forest was different in the daylight. Benign. I told myself the hand at the window had been shadows and stress and isolation playing tricks. Humans are pattern recognition machines. We see faces in static and hands in darkness. I was just tired. I was filling my fuel cans when I found the second body. It was human. The remains were partially buried in snow and positioned against a massive fallen spruce. The corpse was so desiccated that it was difficult to assess time of death or cause. The bones were exposed in several places, the clothing dissolved to fiber and tatters. But one detail was immediately apparent. The bones had been rearranged. The legs were crossed at angles that no living human could achieve. The spine curved into a helix, vertebrae twisted to form a corkscrew. The skull faced backward, attached still to the spine but rotated 180 degrees. The jaw hung open in a permanent scream. This was the same work as the dog, the same examination, the same architectural knowledge of joints and articulation. But this was worse because it had taken longer, because the positioning had been more elaborate, because whatever had done this had the intelligence to consider composition, to arrange the remains with what might have been artistic intent. The clothing had a Park Service patch. My hands were too numb to search for an identification, and some part of me didn't want to know who this had been. If I didn't confirm the identity, I could preserve the possibility that this person was not Richard, that Richard had simply left his job and gone to live quietly elsewhere, the way he'd written in his log. But I knew, November 1987 and 1992 and now 2024, something that returned on a cycle, something that expected the ranger would be here waiting. I marked the location on my GPS, photographed everything despite the cold burning my face, and I walked back to the cabin. I called the ranger station again, this time with urgency and clarity. Unconfirmed human remains, approximately 18 months exposure based on clothing degradation, recommend recovery team and forensics. The voice on the other end was different now, not crackling but sharp with attention. Confirm your safety status. Do you have adequate supplies? Recommend you relocate to lower elevation. I'm staying, I heard myself say. I need to understand what's happening here. Silence on the radio. Then, don't recommend that. Weather forecast shows another system moving in. Recommend. I turned off the radio. December arrived like a held breath. The snow was 4 feet deep in the meadows, 15 feet in the ravines. The temperature stabilized at around -10, survivable if I remained careful. The ranger station had logged my position and status, and they were watching me now, though they could do nothing from that distance. The isolation was complete. I spent my daylight hours in a pattern of careful routine. Morning, inventory supplies, check the generator, perform maintenance. Midday, patrol the cabin perimeter for tracks or signs. Afternoon, update the logbook, document observations, compress fear into words on paper. Evening, prepare a single meal, tend the fire, and pray for unconsciousness. But my mind was no longer producing unconsciousness. My mind was running complex patterns, trying to solve the problem of what lived in these mountains. A creature, I'd begun thinking of it as singular, was intelligent. That was the terrifying calculus. Not a bear, not even the mythological Sasquatch. This was something that understood human architecture, that studied anatomy, that could navigate terrain in complete darkness and move with purpose. The hand at the window hadn't been accident, it had been demonstration. I studied the park archives, looking for patterns and disappearances. There was a hiker in 1975 who'd vanished near Kintla. Her body was never recovered. Another couple in 1982 found 3 days later standing in CA Pass, unable to speak or move voluntarily. They were flown out by helicopter and died within a week. A ranger in 1989 named Kenneth resigned suddenly without explanation. Kenneth's forwarding address led me to an obituary from 1991. Listed cause of death, suicide. In 1998, a group of photographers reported seeing something large moving through the forest. They described the gait as wrong, the proportions impossible, the movements too fluid. Park rangers investigated and found nothing. Richard had documented 2 encounters that he'd permitted himself to record. Margaret, presumably his wife or partner, had stopped coming to the cabin after 1987. She had left him out here alone, watching, documenting, waiting for the thing to return. On December 12th, I received a visitor. He appeared on the trail in the afternoon, approaching the cabin on foot, unarmed, wearing inadequate clothing for the temperature. He was a man in his 60s, gray-bearded, with the weathered face of someone who spent his life in mountains. He carried no pack, no supplies, nothing but himself. I watched him through the window, rifle in hand, trying to process why anyone would be here, how anyone had arrived without a vehicle, how he was surviving the cold in a denim jacket. He reached the cabin door and knocked. I didn't open it. Instead, I called through the wood. "The trail's closed. You need to leave." "My name is Robert Quinnland," he called back, his voice steady and calm. "I was the ranger before Richard. I need to talk to you about what's happening here." I opened the door. That was foolish, but I did it. He was exactly as cold as he should have been, shivering, his breath coming in short gasps. I brought him inside, provided coffee, watched him carefully as he warmed. He accepted all of this with a grateful nod but no explanation. "How did you get here?" I asked finally. "Drove to the end of the road. Hiked in. It's only 3 miles. He sipped the coffee. "I'm not here officially. No one knows I'm here except you. Why come at all?" He looked at me with eyes that had seen things. "Because you called the ranger station, because I saw the report, and because I knew that you'd find the body soon, and once you found the body, you'd start trying to leave, and I couldn't let you leave without understanding." "Understanding what?" But I already knew. I'd been understanding for weeks. What you're dealing with here, what lives in these mountains, what Richard couldn't escape. He set down his coffee. "In 1979, I was stationed at a ranger post near Mount Jackson. Very similar assignment to yours, very remote. And in November, I encountered something large, something that didn't move the way things move. I reported it to the Park Service. They said it was probably a bear. I knew it wasn't a bear. Over the next month, people started going missing. Day hikers, mostly. We'd find them, eventually. Sometimes they were in impossible places. Sometimes they were hurt in ways that took days to understand. One hiker was found with his clothes still on and his body inside them in a way that Let's say the clothing fit perfectly, but the skeleton beneath it had been dislocated at every joint. Like someone had studied the diagram of a human body and tried to assemble one from memory. I felt my stomach move toward my throat. I lasted 8 months, Robert continued. Then I left. Just like Richard left. Just like Margaret left. Just like everyone who understands what's happening here eventually leaves. The thing is, I don't think it's the entity that's driving people away. I think it's the knowledge. The knowledge that there's something here that doesn't fit in the world as we understand it. That's what breaks people. Not the danger, the impossibility. What is it? I asked. Is it a Sasquatch? Is it something from the Kootenai tribe stories? Robert was quiet for a long moment. I've spent 40 years trying to answer that question. I've read everything. Kootenai folklore, Blackfoot stories, colonial accounts. Nothing matches exactly. But there's something in the oldest accounts, the ones from the 1700s and earlier. There are descriptions of a creature that watches. A creature that lives between behaviors, that can move through terrain in ways that defy physics, that's obsessed with human anatomy because it's trying to understand how we work. Some of the stories call it a watcher, some call it a student. Some call it a thing that should never have existed at all. And you're telling me this thing lives at Quinnland Lake? That it's permanent? I'm telling you it cycles. It arrives in October. It stays through the cold months when humans are scarce and movement is difficult. It studies things, animals, humans, the ecosystem. By March it's gone. Then it returns the next October. It's been doing this for at least 200 years that I can find documented. Probably longer. I walked to the window. The sun was setting, and darkness was approaching. Why would you come back? Why come to warn me? Because I couldn't stop thinking about it, Robert said. Because I had to know if someone else would encounter it. Because I'm the only other person alive who can tell you the truth. He paused. And because I wanted to confirm something. What? That I wasn't insane. That what I saw was real. That someone else would see it too and understand that I wasn't making it up. The weight of that confession hung between us. Two men seeking validation for impossible experience. It should have comforted me. Instead, it deepened the vertigo. Robert stayed the night. He slept in the spare bunk, and I kept watch through the darkness, rifle loaded, every sense alert. The clicking never started. The night was almost preternaturally quiet. In the morning, he prepared to leave. I tried to convince him to stay, to take shelter from the cold. But he was resolved. I have to get back before dark, he said. I'm 72 years old, and I'm not staying in these mountains after sunset. I wrote him a note with the location of the body, information for the authorities. He took it solemnly. Before he left, I asked, "Does it kill people?" "No," he said. "That's what I could never get people to understand. It doesn't kill them, it studies them, and then it lets them go." But the trauma of being studied that intimately, by something that intelligent and inhuman, that's what kills them. Eventually. Slowly. Like it's killing you right now. Just by existing in the same place. He left at first light. I watched him disappear into the forest, and I was alone again. 3 days after Robert left, I found the catalog. It was in the clearing beyond the eastern meadow, arranged on the snow with precision. 53 pieces of bone and bone fragments, positioned in anatomical order. A skull, vertebrae arranged in sequence, ribs fanned like an open book, long bones laid parallel. Phalanges arranged by size. This was a skeleton, but not one creature's skeleton. This was composite. The bones were different ages, different sizes, different colors. Some were bleached nearly white with age. Others were darker, fresher. The skull was human, but the ribs were too large, too thick. The femur was curved in a way no human femur curves. This was a catalog. An inventory. I photographed it with trembling hands. I didn't touch anything. I understood with sudden clarity that this was a message. This was showing me its collection. This was demonstrating that it had been studying living things for a very long time. That night, the clicking returned. But it was different now. It was coming from inside the cabin. I found the scratches on the back of the wood stove. Dozens of them, fresh ones, gouging deep into the metal. Click, 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 over and over, something with claws or nails dragging across steel to produce that sound. But there was nothing there when I looked. The stove was empty. The chimney hole was secured. I sat in the center of the cabin, rifle across my lap, and I didn't move for hours. Around midnight, I heard something at the roof. Not scratching, dragging. Something was pulling itself across the shingles, moving slowly toward the chimney. I heard the weight of it, a heavy, deliberate movement that took nearly 40 minutes to cross the length of the cabin. When it reached the chimney, it stopped. I waited for the next sound. When it came, it was almost worse than any animal sound I'd ever heard. It was a sound like something forcing itself into a space that it didn't fit. like tissue and bone being compressed into geometry that shouldn't yield. A wet, tearing sound, a sound of something changing shape, folding itself, rearranging, then silence. It had gotten in through the chimney. I sealed my bedroom door with furniture, backed myself into the corner, rifle pointed at the entrance. I spent the entire night in that position, listening for movement, for the clicking, for any indication of where it was. The cabin was small, no more than 800 square feet. If something was inside, I should be able to hear it, but I heard nothing except my own heartbeat and breath. In the morning, I searched the entire cabin. I found nothing. No tracks, no disturbance, no evidence that anything had entered. But the clicking had been real. The sound of something compressing itself through the chimney had been real. I was holding sanity the way you hold water in open hands. The next day I began breaking down the cabin from inside. I moved furniture into the center, created a smaller, tighter space. I sealed windows with boards. I reduced the perimeter I had to defend. This was not logical behavior. This was fear becoming action. On December 19th, I found the tracks in the snow outside my barricaded window. Human-shaped but wrong. The feet placed themselves with toes spread too wide. The gait swayed, unstable, as if the creature was still learning how to walk in a human configuration. It had circumnavigated the entire cabin 3 times, the path visible in the deep snow, the creature following the exact same route repeatedly like it was memorizing the building's geography. I added everything to the logbook: drawings of the tracks, descriptions of the sounds, analysis of the catalog of bones. I was documenting like Richard had documented, like I could paper over the impossible with enough detail and enough words. That night there was a knock on the door, not an aggressive sound. Polite, measured, a human knock. "Who's there?" I called, rifle ready. Silence. I waited 5 minutes. The knock came again. Same pattern. Polite, patient. "Identify yourself." The door handle began to turn. It was locked, thank God. The handle rotated slowly, almost experimentally, testing the mechanism. Then it released. The knock came once more. The handle turned again. I fired through the door. The rifle bucked against my shoulder, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. I fired 4 more times, spacing the shots to cover the handle mechanism. The 5th shot finally jammed the lock. For the next minute, nothing happened. No sound, no movement. Then I heard the tearing sound again, the compression sound, and I understood. It was attempting to enter through the walls themselves. I abandoned the cabin. I threw supplies into a pack with no organization, grabbed the rifle and extra ammunition, and I left through the back window I'd already forced open. I didn't think about the snow. I didn't think about the temperature. I didn't think about the darkness that was descending. I just ran toward the trail that led down the mountain. The trail is 8 miles long, cut and maintained for summer tourists. In December, under 3 feet of snow, it becomes a different proposition. I moved down the mountain by memory and instinct, the rifle slowing me, snow entering my boots, my breath coming in sobs that had nothing to do with exertion. It was perhaps 2 miles down that I realized I was being followed. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. Not the clicking, not any sound really, but rather the absence of sound around a moving shape. The night animal's silence, the forest holding its breath. It wasn't hurrying, it was content to follow, to match my pace, to maintain distance. I understood then that it wasn't interested in catching me. It was interested in experiencing the chase. It was learning how humans moved when desperate. I moved faster, abandoning caution, stumbling through the snow. The trail became indistinct. I'd gone off the proper route, I realized, too late. The forest around me was dense and undifferentiated. No clearings, no landmarks, just trees and darkness pressing in from all sides. The clicking started again, but it was different now. Faster. Excited. That's when I heard the voices. They were calling my name. Multiple voices. "Marcus. Marcus. Come back. Come help us. We need help." The voices were familiar. They were park rangers I'd never met but whose names I'd seen in the logs. Richard calling to me. Kenneth calling to me. Voices that had no right to exist. I kept moving. The terrain became suddenly open. I'd found a cleared meadow. See a pass. My scattered mind recognized. The voices grew louder, became a chorus. They surrounded me in the darkness, coming from all directions. They were describing what had happened to them. They were asking for company. They were begging me to understand that isolation was what broke them, that the creature had made them isolated by making them experience things that no one could share. I heard a sound behind me. Footsteps. Not quite human footsteps, but close. Deliberate. Approaching, that's when the light found me. A flashlight beam bright and sudden cutting through the darkness. I spun, rifle raised, and saw a human figure, then another. A search and rescue team, emergent from the darkness of the upper trail. Marcus. A man's voice, relieved. We've been searching for 3 hours. Your cabin's been called in as possibly dangerous. We're evacuating you. I nearly collapsed with relief. Real humans. Real help. Real. I stumbled toward them, and the voices cut off. The presence that had been following me vanished as if it had never existed. It was gone. The team transported me down the mountain in the darkness and cold. I don't remember much of the journey. I remember reaching the road. I remember the heated truck and blankets. I remember driving to the ranger station and being processed through a series of interviews. They asked if I'd experienced any psychological distress. I said yes. They asked if I'd been under any unusual stress. Yes. They asked if I felt safe. I lied and said I didn't know. The body in the forest was retrieved. The remains were never formally identified, but the Park Service confirmed that the clothing matched Richard's description from his employment file. They listed him as a recovered fatality, cause of death unknown, time of death estimated at 18 months prior to discovery. I filed a detailed incident report. I included Robert Quinnland's statements. I included the description of the creature, the catalog of bones, the sounds, the experiences. I included Richard's logbooks and his cryptic entries. The Park Service buried the report in a file marked psychological incident. They recommended that I receive psychiatric evaluation. They suggested that isolation and stress had created a framework in which I'd interpreted normal phenomena as threatening. I was discharged from my position effective immediately. Robert Quinnland was never found. The rangers who searched for him found no trace of his arrival or departure. No vehicle was registered to him in any database. No address matched the one he'd given me. It's entirely possible that Robert Quinnland never came to that cabin at all. It's been 6 months since I left Glacier National Park. I'm living in Missoula now, in the city, with lights that don't shut off and people surrounding me constantly. I sleep poorly and I don't explain why. I've seen a therapist twice, and I've stopped going because I can't articulate the problem in words that create solutions. But I updated my research. I found more cases. I found missing hikers in 1743 near the same location. I found a Kootenai oral history that described something that lived in the high mountains, something that came in winter, something that watched and studied and left before spring. I found a scientific paper from 1954 describing an unknown primate species possibly inhabiting the northern Rockies, written by a researcher who disappeared before submitting his findings for peer review. Most importantly, I've been checking the ranger assignments for Glacier National Park. The position has been filled again. There's a new ranger starting in September. She's young, probably in her late 20s, probably thinking about stable employment and mountain solitude. I have her name and address. I've drafted a letter maybe 100 times. I've never sent it. What would I say? Don't go? You're in danger? That something lives there that defies categorization and will spend the cold months studying you, and the study itself will fracture your mind? She wouldn't believe me. No one would. But I watch the weather in Montana. I watch the articles about wildlife sightings. When October arrives, I pay attention to whether any hikers go missing near Kintla Lake. When November comes, I wait, and I haven't slept properly in 6 months because I'm terrified that one of these nights I'll hear that clicking sound, that metronome of the impossible, and I'll understand that it followed me down the mountain, that it studied me so thoroughly that it knows exactly how to find me, that it's never going to let me go. I keep a rifle under my bed, though I know that won't help. I keep the lights on through the night. And I reread Richard's logbook entry sometimes, the one about how something that moves wrongly, that defies explanation, can't be fought or reasoned with or escaped. It can only be survived. And survival, I've learned, sometimes isn't enough. I accepted the position at Yellowstone because I needed to disappear, not in the romantic sense that draws people to wilderness work. The kind of disappearing where you find yourself staring at mountains and suddenly understand that life is bigger than your failures. No, I needed to become someone new. My previous career in Denver had imploded in the way careers do when you start drinking to manage anxiety, and anxiety compounds the drinking. The department didn't fire me directly. They encouraged me to seek alternative employment. My ex-wife had already moved to Phoenix. My apartment lease was up. The only person who still called was my mother, and our conversations had become so strained they felt like conversations with a stranger who knew all my worst moments. The National Park Service wasn't asking too many questions in September of that year. A ranger position at one of Yellowstone's remote fire stations, Tower Roosevelt District, came open when the previous ranger had quit abruptly in late August. When I called, the district supervisor, Marcus, spoke in the practiced patience of someone accustomed to hiring unstable people. He didn't ask why I wanted the job. He asked only if I could work alone, if I could maintain equipment, if I could respond to emergencies. I lied and said yes to all of it. The cabin sat 12 miles from the nearest developed area, accessible by a rough road that became impassable by November. It was equipped with a radio, a generator, a wood stove, and solar panels that provided enough electricity for basic needs. Water came from a pump system connected to a spring. The job involved fire management, maintaining trails, documenting wildlife observations, and responding to lost hikers or emergency calls across the district. I would be alone except for quarterly visits for maintenance and an annual inspection. I drove north through Montana. In the third week of September, my truck loaded with the few possessions I'd decided to keep. The landscape opened gradually, swallowing the suburban creep of the state until it was nothing but vast grassland, then forest, then the towering blue shadow of the mountains themselves. It should have felt like redemption. That was what I told myself. It felt like silence. The kind of silence where you can hear your own failure as a constant, rhythmic thing, like a loose wire buzzing in the dark. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Single room with a partition dividing the living area from a narrow bed frame. A wood stove that looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in a season. Metal shelving with old field manuals, maps, and a logbook dating back 7 years. The previous ranger had written careful entries about snow depth, trail conditions, wildlife reports. His last entry, dated August 14th, read simply, "Leaving, can't stay, something wrong here." No further explanation. I wrote it off as the paranoia of a burned-out employee. I told myself that I would be different. The first month was almost peaceful. I rebuilt the wood stove, scrubbed the cabin, organized the equipment storage, and familiarized myself with the radio protocols. I hiked the trails in the district. There were 8 primary routes ranging from 2 to 12 miles. The forest was changing as fall approached. The aspens shifted from green to that brilliant temporary yellow. The nights grew teeth. The evening light began dying earlier. By mid-October, it was dark by 6. The generator hummed its steady rhythm after sunset, and I read the previous ranger's field manuals, trying to absorb knowledge that felt increasingly abstract. I wasn't a naturalist. I was a man running from himself, and the wilderness was indifferent to that fact. The radio crackled on October 19th around 8 in the evening. A family had become separated from a guided tour group near Tower Falls. The parents had made it back to the shuttle. 2 teenagers, a boy and a girl, both 16, were missing. They'd left the trail to find a bathroom and hadn't returned. The official protocol was to alert the ranger station to the south, initiate a formal search at first light, and coordinate with helicopter support if necessary. But the parents were desperate, and there were still 2 hours of remaining daylight, and I was new enough to the job to believe I could make a difference. I grabbed a flashlight, a radio, and a jacket, and I drove the rough access road out to Tower Falls. The parking area was already lit by red and blue lights. Park rangers, emergency responders, maybe 30 people moving in coordinated confusion. I found the parents, a man and woman in matching North Face jackets, faces white with panic. Their daughter Emma's phone had GPS. The signal placed her and her brother roughly 3 miles southeast of Tower Falls, down into a ravine system that wasn't part of any developed trail. "I'll go in," I told them. "I know this area." That was a lie. I didn't know anything. But I was in uniform. I was supposed to know things. The trail into that ravine was overgrown, marked only by the kind of sign you read when there's desperation involved. Broken branches, disturbed ground, the recent passage of human bodies moving too fast. My flashlight beam caught the dense forest, the undergrowth that grabbed at my legs, the smell of juniper and drying vegetation, and something else. Something animal and faintly chemical that I couldn't place. I called out their names. Emma. Marcus. My voice sounded thin in that space, absorbed immediately by the forest, without the usual satisfaction of hearing your own words return. I'd been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when I found the boy sitting on a fallen log, his right leg clearly broken, the kind of obvious break where the shin bends in a direction it shouldn't. His face was shocked, gray, but he was conscious. He said his name was Marcus, that his sister had gone looking for help, that she'd left maybe 5 minutes ago, that she'd seemed afraid. The fear part is what made me move forward. Not afraid of the forest, but afraid for him, of the night. of the practical problem of extracting a teenager with a broken leg from a ravine. I radioed down and gave my position. I applied a makeshift splint using saplings and the boy's jacket. Then I told him I'd find his sister and we'd get back to the main trail together. I walked further into the forest. My flashlight beam made the world into a small circle of light surrounded by absolute darkness. The forest floor was uneven, rocks and roots and hidden depressions that threatened my ankle with every step. The temperature was dropping with the finality of October in the mountains, and I'd left my jacket with the boy. I called her name again, Emma. Emma. That's when I heard the first sound, not her voice, but something that sounded almost like her voice. A call that seemed to come from the direction I was already walking, pulling me deeper into the ravine. It occurred to me, with the delayed clarity of someone already committed to a bad decision, that I was lost. Not lost in the sense of lacking direction, but lost in the sense of being inside something, rather than passing through it. The forest had wrapped around me without my noticing. I turned to walk back toward the boy and couldn't quite find the way. My flashlight revealed the same trees, the same undergrowth, but the ravine seemed to have gone three-dimensional in a way that ravines shouldn't. Every direction looked equally wrong. That's when I heard the breathing. It was behind me, perhaps 40 feet away, moving parallel to my path, not human breathing. The rhythm was too long, too deliberate, with a rasp that suggested lungs designed for a larger body. I spun with my flashlight raised and caught nothing but trees and darkness, but I could hear it still, that rhythmic inhalation and exhalation, matching my pace. I moved faster. So did the sound. I called out that I was a ranger, that I had radio contact, that help was coming. The breathing continued, unchanged. Something broke my peripheral vision. A shadow moving through the understory, perhaps 60 feet to my left, moving with the deliberate speed of something that knew the terrain perfectly. I ran. The professional training said to move to high ground, to gather under a rock overhang, to create a defensible position. The animal instinct simply said run. I don't know how long I ran through that forest. The flashlight became a liability, the narrow beam of light making me tunnel-visioned while the darkness contained everything. I shut it off and moved by the faint luminescence of the dying sky filtering through the tree canopy. I could still hear the breathing behind me, but it had stopped pacing my speed. Now it was getting closer. I burst from the forest onto a rocky outcropping and my feet went out from under me. I tumbled down a short embankment and landed hard against a tree trunk. Pain exploded across my ribs. I lay there gasping, trying not to move, trying to listen over the sound of my own heartbeat. For 5 minutes, there was nothing but my breathing and the forest's breathing and the sound of water somewhere below. Then I heard the other ranger's voice on my radio, calling my position, asking if I was okay. The sound of other humans, coordinated and real, seemed to break something. I climbed back to the outcropping and found a trail marker, an old plastic rectangle nailed to a tree. I knew this marker. I was northeast of Tower Falls, roughly on the eastern rim of the ravine system. I was closer to the cabin than to the parking area. I oriented myself by the marker and began walking, moving quickly but not running, trying to project the kind of calm that predators don't usually bother with. Behind me, the breathing had stopped entirely. Ahead, I could see the gradual lightening that indicated the elevated terrain leading back toward the road. I found Emma an hour later, sitting beneath a ponderosa pine, her ankle visibly swollen. She was crying silently, the kind of crying that comes after panic has exhausted itself. She said she'd heard something moving in the forest, that she'd climbed the tree to get away from it, that she'd been terrified the whole time that if she came down it would be there. I brought her back to the main area. Medical teams took over. The boy was extracted. The parents thanked me with the kind of gratitude that felt obscene, as if I'd deliberately gone into the forest and saved their children, rather than wandering through darkness towards something I still didn't understand. The incident report noted my quick response and good judgment. The superintendent mentioned a commendation. I drove back to the cabin at 2 a.m. and sat in front of the wood stove for 6 hours without speaking, without moving, trying to process the idea that the breathing I'd heard was probably a bear, a large grizzly, possibly, territorial, disturbed by the commotion. That was the logical explanation. That was what I told myself. But I kept seeing that moment when something in the darkness had moved with perfect intelligence, the way it had paced me. The way the breathing had gotten closer with each passing second, as if the forest itself was slowly tightening its grip. In the logbook I wrote, "Successful search and rescue. 2 missing teenagers located and extracted. Likely bear activity in the ravine system. Will need to review emergency protocols." I didn't write what I was thinking. That something had been hunting in the darkness, and I had been somewhere between its prey and something that interested it less. I didn't write that I was staying anyway. October bled into November, and the light began its terminal decline. The forest changed color the way a body changes in the days after death. Gold fading to brown, then to the gray of bare branches and dying vegetation. The temperature dropped below freezing most nights. The cabin's wood stove became the center of everything. I spent hours feeding it, watching the flames, trying not to think about that breathing in the dark. But the forest had other ways of keeping me aware. On November 2nd, I found the elk. It was in a clearing roughly 2 miles from the cabin, one of the natural meadows that breaks up the density of the forest. The animal was massive, a bull at least 400 pounds, its antlers still bearing the velvet of early season. But it was dead in a way that suggested something more recent than simple predation. The kill itself looked almost like a bear had made it. Slashing wounds across the body, the animal's chest opened as if by claws. But the pattern was wrong. Bears kill downward, using their superior weight and strength to drive prey into the ground. This elk was positioned against a fallen log, and the wounds came from above and at an angle that suggested something taller than a bear, attacking with something that wasn't quite a claw but wasn't quite anything else. I forced myself to document it properly. I took photographs, noted the location in the logbook, reported it to the ranger station south. The supervisor said it was likely bear activity. They had been more active that fall due to some food shortage in the higher elevations. Bears range over large areas, he said. I might see more kills before winter fully set in, but something in my chest knew that what I was looking at wasn't bear predation. On November 6th, I hiked the Northern Trail, an 8-mile loop that takes you through the densest part of the forest before opening onto a ridge with a view of the Absaroka Mountains. The trail maintenance was part of my job. I was looking for downed trees, storm damage, signs of erosion. What I found instead was a shelter. Not an official structure. The Park Service would have records of any shelter on their land. This was something constructed from branches and deadfall, positioned against the base of a massive pine tree. It was roughly 7 feet long, barely 4 feet high, deliberately positioned to face south toward open air while the north and east sides were enclosed by fallen logs stacked like a barrier. Inside was a nest of dried grasses, bark, and what looked like torn canvas, probably from a tent that had been destroyed months or years ago. But the disturbing part wasn't the shelter itself. The disturbing part was the smell. Animal and organic, but also wrong, like nothing I could categorize, and there were marks on the inside of the log barrier. Long, parallel gouges in the wood as if something had been scratching at the interior repeatedly, deliberately. The gouges were deep enough that I could sink my finger into them. I stood there for a long time, trying to construct a rational explanation. Bears sometimes create resting areas. Mountain lions will use shelters, but mountain lions are solitary, and a cat wouldn't create interior scratches like that. And no bear would deliberately construct something this sophisticated. The shelter was too intentional, too considered. It had been made by something that understood the concept of protection, of barriers, of controlling a space. I burned it down, not in any official capacity, not reported. I used a lighter and dry grass, and I watched as the structure collapsed into flames. The smell when it burned was worse, thick and chemical and wrong in a way that made my stomach clench. I stood downwind and waited until there was nothing left but ash and blackened logs. On the walk back, I became aware that I was being followed, not the way I'd been followed in the ravine, not actively hunted. This was different. There was something moving in the forest parallel to the trail, keeping pace with me, maintaining a distance of perhaps 100 yards. I caught glimpses of it through the trees, a shape that seemed to shift and reconfigure depending on the angle I viewed it from. Sometimes it looked bipedal, sometimes quadrupedal, sometimes like it was moving in a way that was neither. I increased my pace. So did whatever was following. I stopped. It stopped. I called out, demanding that it show itself, that this was Ranger's land and I had authority here. My voice sounded ridiculous in the emptiness. That's when I heard it, the sound of its breathing, the rhythm I remembered from the ravine. But it was different now. Hungrier, closer. It had closed the distance to perhaps 60 feet. And it was breathing in that deliberate way that said it was no longer bothering to hide what it was. It had decided I was aware, and awareness changed the rules. I ran for the cabin with my heart threatening to explode in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't rationalize. I simply moved through the forest as fast as the terrain allowed, branches whipping my face, my legs pumping mechanically. Behind me, I could hear the steady crash of something much larger moving without concern for stealth. The cabin came into view. I burst through the door and locked it behind me, the deadbolt that I'd never thought I'd need to use. The generator hummed its rhythm. The radio sat on the shelf, but I didn't reach for it. I sat on the floor of the cabin with my back against the door, listening to my own breathing, listening for the sound from outside. For 3 hours, nothing happened. The forest settled into the sounds of evening, wind in the branches, the distant call of a raven, the normal noises that sustain the wilderness. I made a fire in the wood stove. I boiled water for tea that I couldn't quite convince myself to drink. When the scratching came on the cabin's exterior walls, it sounded almost gentle, not aggressive, not desperate. Just the methodical sound of something examining the structure, running whatever appendages it possessed across the wood and metal, testing for weakness. The scratching moved from the east wall to the north wall to the west wall, taking what seemed like an hour to complete a circuit. I stood in the center of the cabin, a knife from the kitchen in one hand, utterly aware of how useless that knife was. The windows were small, barely 2 feet across. The door was solid. The roof was sound. These were the things I focused on to prevent my mind from spiraling completely into something that looked like insanity. The scratching stopped around 10 in the evening. I waited another 4 hours, until the woods showed the first signs of the pre-dawn light that the forest gets in late autumn. At that point, silence seemed like permission to move, so I gathered supplies and drove down the rough road toward the ranger station south of Tower Roosevelt. I didn't file a formal report. I told Marcus, the supervisor, that I needed a mental health evaluation, that my previous drinking problem might be resurfacing, that I was experiencing some kind of anxiety-induced paranoia. He was sympathetic. He suggested I take a week of paid leave, visit the town of Mammoth, see if a change of scenery would help. He offered to post a temporary ranger in my cabin. I told him no. I said I needed to be alone, that the solitude would help me recalibrate. I said I'd be fine after a few days. I wasn't interested in help. I was interested in information. That night, after returning to the cabin, I went through the old field manuals and logbooks more carefully. The ranger who preceded me had written 23 field entries. The one before him had written 147. The ranger before that, whose tenure dated back 5 years, had written only 7 before abruptly resigning. The pattern repeated backward through the logbooks. Rangers serving at this station averaged 2-3 months before resignation or transfer request. The average for other Yellowstone ranger stations was 8 to 10 months. Something about this station was driving rangers away, and whatever I was hearing in the forest knew. It knew my schedule. It was learning the perimeter of the cabin. It was testing my fear response. It was doing something that resembled hunting, except hunters don't study prey for days before committing to the kill. Hunters simply hunt. This was stalking. This was something building towards something else. The lake occupies a depression in the forest roughly 7 miles northeast of the cabin, accessible by a trail that most tourists never walked. I'd hiked it once in October and found it beautiful in a way that hurt. The dark water reflecting the mountains, the complete absence of human presence, the sense of being somewhere untouched. On November 12th, with the light dying earlier and earlier each day, I decided to bring my camp gear and spend the night there. I'm not sure I can explain the logic without sounding insane. Some part of me believed that confronting the thing in the forest directly might provide clarity. Another part simply needed to move, to do something other than sit in the cabin feeling like prey in a trap. And a third part, the part that I'd been trying to ignore, wanted to find where the tracks led, where the creature was denning, what it was planning. The hike-in took 4 hours in the gathering darkness. I used my flashlight minimally, moving by feel and memory as much as anything else. The forest knew I was coming. I could sense it the way you sense someone's attention on you in a crowded room, not by evidence but by the subtle shifts in air and sound and the basic texture of space. The lake appeared as a black mirror beneath the dying light. The shoreline was rocky, with a few areas of sand and coarser gravel. I found a spot with clear sightlines and set up my tent, a small backpacking model that I'd brought not from any hiking tradition but simply because it was in the cabin's supply closet. As darkness completed its invasion, I built a fire. The flames seemed too bright, broadcasting my location to everything in the forest. But I needed the fire. I needed light and warmth and the psychological comfort of something approaching control. That's when I noticed the tracks. They came from the forest and approached the clearing I'd chosen. The pattern suggested bipedal movement, but the stride was wrong, too long, covering maybe 6 feet with each step. The footprints themselves were partially obscured by the rocky ground, but where they appeared in the sand, I could see that the feet were wrong, too elongated. Too many toes, or perhaps not enough, but arranged in a configuration that no human or standard mammal possessed. The tracks circled the clearing twice and returned to the forest. The creature had found me. It had walked around me in full visibility of my fire, and it was close enough that I could have heard it breathing if I'd been paying attention. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire and read by flashlight old field guides about predators and bears and wolves. I drank coffee from a camping pot and watched the lake's surface for movement. The water was still, reflecting the stars like a dark mirror. Nothing broke that reflection except once, around 3 a.m., when something large moved in the water some distance from shore, a displacement that suggested something 4 or 5 feet long disturbing the surface. The thing in the forest was not alone. When dawn came with its weak gray light, I hiked around the lake's perimeter and found more evidence. Scratch marks on trees, some of them recent enough to still show the pale wood beneath the bark, scat that resembled large cat feces but was larger and contained what looked like human hair, gray and dark, mixed with what I realized was fabric fiber. There were remains of something near the water's edge, partially buried beneath stones. I uncovered them carefully, my hands shaking. It was the skull of what might have been a deer, though the damage suggested something more violent than a simple predation. The bone was scored with marks that suggested whatever had killed it had wanted to cause maximum trauma, not quick death. The teeth marks, if they were teeth marks, were too large to be from any creature in the official roster of Yellowstone wildlife. The sun was rising fuller now, and with its light came a sense of terrible clarity. I understood, in the way you understand things in horror that shouldn't be possible, that this thing had been living in the Yellowstone for years, maybe decades, maybe much longer. It had learned the territory. It had learned the rhythm of visitors and rangers and search parties, and now it was learning me, studying my patterns, determining whether I was something worth eating or something that posed enough threat to remain interesting. I hiked back to the cabin in the full daylight, abandoning all pretense of stealth. If it was going to come for me, I wanted it to happen where I had walls and a fire and tools. Waiting in the forest felt like playing a game on its terms, and those terms were written in a language I didn't speak. The cabin was undisturbed when I arrived. The fire had long since gone out, but the wood stove still held some warmth. I made food I couldn't eat and coffee I forgot to drink. I tried to call the ranger station, but the radio was producing only static. That was when I understood the other part of what was happening. The thing hadn't come for me yet because it was testing whether I would remain, whether I would stay in this isolated place, cut off from help, running low on supplies, waiting for the snow that would seal the roads and trap me completely. It was asking if I would choose to stay, and in some terrible rational part of my mind I realized that I already had. The first snow fell on November 18th, early and heavy. By November 20th, the rough road leading out was officially impassable. The district supervisor radioed to confirm that they were suspending vehicle access to the station until spring, that they'd arranged for supply drops via helicopter every 3 weeks, that I should radio if there were any emergencies. I assured them everything was fine. I was adjusting well, I said. The solitude was healing. The hunger started in the second week of November. Not my hunger, though that was present too. I'd stopped cooking regular meals, instead eating canned goods and the dried food stocks in the storage closet. The hunger I'm referring to was outside. It was a pressure in the forest, a sense of something wound tight with need, its metabolism accelerating as the winter deepened. The thing, I had started thinking of it as a singular entity, though some nights I wondered if it was many, was moving closer to the cabin. Some nights I would hear it pacing the perimeter and I would count the laps. 12 passes one night, 17 the next. Each lap seemed to cover less ground, the spiral tightening like something circling a drain. I kept my field journal. I documented everything. The time of the sounds, their location, any physical evidence of movement. Scratches appeared on the window frame, fresh gouges in the wood. Once I found the dried remnant of something that looked like hair caught on a nail, matted and long and wrong in its texture. There was a night, I think it was November 27th, when the thing attempted to dig beneath the cabin's foundation. I was awake, as I usually was, sitting by the wood stove. The sound started around 2 a.m., a deep rhythmic scraping from the north side of the structure. I took my flashlight and crowbar, and I went outside into weather that was somewhere between rain and snow, that wet cold that penetrates deeper than mere temperature. The thing had created a trench roughly a foot deep along the cabin's foundation, working at the soil and rock with what must have been considerable strength. When my flashlight caught it in the act of digging, it didn't flee. It turned to look at me, and I saw its eyes for the first time. They weren't animal eyes, they were too intelligent, too aware. The color was a shade that looked like silver when light caught them, but primarily they were dark, so dark that they seemed like absence, like looking into eyes that contained nothing but void. It was looking at me with the kind of concentration that suggested it was analyzing me, determining what I represented as an obstacle to what it wanted. Its body was humanoid in a way that made my mind recoil. The proportions were wrong in every direction. The limbs were too long. The torso seemed to lack proper proportion, and the way it moved, it was standing on two legs, but there was something in the movement that suggested it was equally comfortable on four. Its skin had a color that seemed to shift depending on the light. Gray, then white, then something that looked almost translucent in spots. I raised the crowbar like a weapon, which was absurd. The creature made a sound, something between a hiss and something deeper, a vibration that I felt in my chest rather than heard with my ears. Then it lowered itself to all fours and retreated into the darkness of the forest, moving with the kind of speed that suggested it had been playing with me, that it could have easily taken me at any point but had chosen not to. I returned to the cabin and filled in the trench with anything heavy I could move. I pushed the generator in front of the foundation gap. I propped the heavy wooden table against the wall, then wedged the stove's metal casing against the table. I was creating barriers that I knew wouldn't stop it, but the act of creating them made me feel less like something waiting to be consumed. By the end of November, the snow had deepened to 3 feet. The helicopter supply drop came as scheduled, and I met the delivery person at the clearing, took the boxes of food and supplies, and didn't mention that I was potentially sharing my forest with something that shouldn't exist. The thing didn't hunt that night. It was as if it was respecting some unspoken agreement that the presence of outsiders meant a temporary truce. December arrived with temperatures that dropped into the negatives. The forest became a different place entirely, quieter, more hostile, drained of color. The thing's activity increased. It was no longer bothering with stealth. It howled from the forest sometimes, a sound like nothing in my experience, something that made dogs, if there had been dogs here, respond with panic. It left evidence everywhere, though I stopped documenting it because the documentation was becoming too extensive, the reality too immediate. On December 7th, I found the campers. There were 2 of them, a man and a woman, both probably in their 60s, set up in what was supposed to be an emergency shelter about 3 miles from the cabin. They had been reported missing, I later learned, from a guided tour group at Tower Falls. That detail made sense. Tower Falls was central to the region, and they'd probably strayed from the trail during one of the guided walks. They'd been missing for 3 weeks. What remained of them was partially preserved by the cold. The cold had slowed decomposition. The cold was actually merciful in that regard. Their shelter was destroyed, and the evidence suggested that they had understood what was coming for them. They'd constructed a barricade from stones and tree branches. They'd built a fire that had long since burned out. They'd probably lasted 2, maybe 3 days before the thing decided that their defenses were inadequate. The thing I cannot quite reconcile with rational thought is that it had left them for me to find. It had positioned them carefully, arranged them almost deliberately, as if it wanted me to know what was coming. Or perhaps it wanted me to know what it was capable of, to understand the depth of my error in choosing to remain. I radioed the ranger station and reported the location and condition of the remains. This time I didn't pretend it was a bear attack. I said it looked like a large predator, that the bodies had been exposed to extreme trauma, that the scene suggested something beyond the normal range of wilderness danger. The response from the superintendent was to authorize an investigation, coordinate with state authorities, and request that I remain in the cabin and await further instruction. They would be sending a team, they said, as soon as the roads were passable. The roads wouldn't be passable for 3 months. By the time we had the phone conversation, the snow was deep enough to bury a car, and more was coming. The isolation wasn't a limitation anymore, it was complete. I was in the cabin, in the forest, with the thing that had orchestrated all of this. Everything else was theory. Everything outside this space was merely speculation about what might happen if I survived. December 15th. The temperature was holding at -8 degrees Fahrenheit. The wood stove was consuming nearly a full cord of wood every week. I'd stopped going outside except for the absolutely necessary trips to the supply shed. The helicopter had made the last drop before the weather became too treacherous for flight. The thing had stopped hiding. It came to the windows at night, and I could see it clearly now. The full horror of its construction was apparent. The elongated body, the skin that seemed to shift between colors, the eyes that contained none of the reflective quality of normal animal eyes. It would press against the glass, It never broke it, though it clearly possessed the strength, and simply observed me with an intensity that was almost meditative. One night, I made a decision that would explain how I'm writing this, how any of this is being recorded. I opened the door. I stood in the doorway of the cabin with the temperature howling around me, with the winter pressing its absolute cold into every space it could find, and I opened the door. The thing emerged from the darkness of the forest with a speed that was almost graceful, covering the 20 feet between the tree line and the cabin in movements that seemed to occur in suspension, as if they were happening outside of normal time. It stopped when it reached the threshold, as if there was some barrier I'd created that it couldn't quite cross. Its breath was visible in the cold air, and the smell that came with it was like every predator and corpse and wrong thing compressed into a single organism. I waited. It waited. The forest waited. "I know what you are," I said, and my voice was steady in a way I'd forgotten it could be. "I know what you've been doing. I know why you're still here instead of killing me." The creature made a sound that might have been communication. It was a tone rather than a word, something that resonated in my chest and made my teeth ache, but there was an intelligence in it that transcended species or normal comprehension. "You're hungry," I said. "Not for meat. For something else. For connection or attention or understanding. For something that kills. The people who came before me couldn't provide that, so they left. But I stayed." The thing tilted its head. An impossibly human gesture on such an inhuman form. "I think," I said slowly, "that we're both lost. Both running from things that destroyed our lives. Both willing to exist in the space that shouldn't be possible because it's better than going back." The creature's eyes changed, became less void, more present. And in that moment of changed perspective, I understood something that the field manuals never explained, that the rangers who fled never wrote down, that the Park Service never acknowledged. The creature wasn't a Wendigo in the pure folklore sense. It was something that had internalized that concept so thoroughly that it had become the hunger itself. It was a physical manifestation of the wilderness's ability to consume not just bodies but context, history, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. And it had found in me something it could communicate with. Another hunger, another refugee, another being that had chosen dissolution over redemption. I stepped back into the cabin and closed the door. The thing didn't follow. Instead, it retreated to the forest's edge and settled, watching the cabin with something that might have been patience or might have been satisfaction. That was December 15th. I'm writing this on December 29th, and I don't know if I'll send it. The snow has reached 4 feet. The temperature has dropped to -15. The food supplies are adequate for another month, perhaps 6 weeks if I ration carefully. The ranger station has stopped trying to contact me. The radio stopped functioning 5 days ago, and I haven't bothered to repair it. Every night, the thing comes to the window. Every night, I sit by the fire and read, aware that it's watching but no longer afraid in the way I was afraid before. The fear has transformed into something else, an understanding perhaps, or a negotiation. I'm documenting this experience because I believe that my previous suicide attempts were failures not because I lacked commitment, but because I lacked courage. The courage to truly disappear, to accept that dissolution wasn't a psychiatric emergency but a possible ending. The thing in the forest understands this. It has seen other humans make this same decision. It is in many ways simply waiting for me to stop pretending that I'm going to leave. The winter hunger is real. It's outside and it's inside. And at some point, probably in February or March, when the isolation becomes complete and the food runs lower and the awareness that help isn't coming becomes certainty, I'll make my decision. I'll open the door again, and this time, I won't close it. The Yellowstone ranger who wrote "Something is Wrong Here" understood this. The ones before him understood it. The campers I found understood it in their final moments. Winter doesn't kill the hunger, it feeds it. And I've discovered that I've been hungry for a very long time. This novel will remain sealed in the cabin, placed in the final supply drop request in case the helicopter comes before the snow becomes permanently impassable. This is not a confession, it's not a warning, it's a record of the moment when someone running from their life finally stops running, when the wilderness offers its particular compassion, not in the form of salvation, but in the form of an ending written into the landscape itself. The supply helicopter arrived on March 14th, exactly as scheduled. The pilot noted that the cabin appeared abandoned. There were signs of habitation, wood burning in the stove, canned goods on shelves, boots arranged by the door, but no person could be found. The investigation was thorough but inconclusive. Search teams brought in over the following weeks found no body, no evidence of what direction a person might have traveled. The cabin's logbook ended on December 29th with an entry that was judged by the district's mental health evaluator as indicating a clear descent into suicidal ideation. The case was eventually filed as death by probable exposure, with the assumption that the ranger had walked into the winter wilderness and allowed it to finish what his own mind had started. No body was ever recovered. The ranger station remained staffed for another 2 years before being downgraded to a seasonal use facility. The forest keeps its own counsel about what happened to the men and women who came before, and about what calls to those who arrive broken enough to listen. The hunger persists in that landscape. It always has, it always will. Some places in the wilderness are not meant for human habitation. Some invitations should never be answered, but for those running from themselves, the distinction becomes impossible to perceive until it's far too late. The forest understands this. The hunger understands this. And perhaps, in the end, so did he.